Well, our special guest tonight, by the way, it is his birthday, and we're so honored that he would take time out of his busy schedule.
And you're making me feel very old.
Oh, heck. Yeah. You know, old or wise and experienced. I think it's probably the latter. You are to be congratulated. But ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know who this gentleman is, this is Richard C. Hoagland. He's a former NASA consultant and science advisor to CBS News and to Walter Cronkite. What Mr. Hoagland has for us tonight is incredible. His research has borne fruit. Now, before I bring him on, let me just say this. We talk all the time about the New World Order, about the Illuminati, about the plans, the big picture. If you read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and this is relevant to tonight, folks. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. If your enemy is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he's superior in strength, evade him. If your opponent is temperamental, seek to irritate him. Now, folks, remember these words as the program unfolds tonight. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. If he's taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. If sovereign and subject are in accord, put division between them. Attack him where he is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. Now, folks, please remember that. Also, remember all of the programs that we've done here this year, last year, and in the context of our guest, what he's about to reveal and present on this program. He's already revealed this on Coast to Coast, and also Dr. Robin Falkov's program as well. But what he's about to talk about tonight, I think, is critical, and is Mr. Hoagland's 4+ decades of experience. His research has been vindicated by recent events, and we'll let him explain it to you. But with that, Mr. Hoagland, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, Doug, I don't know quite what to say after that intro. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm going to address, one of you is Doug and the other is Joe, right?
That's correct. The young pup is Joe. I'm Doug. And,
I'm everybody.
Yeah, I'm the verbose one. So
okay.
All right. So.
Well, all right. You actually mentioned it in your intro. This is a big picture conversation. In fact, you can't get much bigger than this. The thing that constantly annoys me about the conversations that people have about the Illuminati and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the East versus West and the strange group that Pulford is talking to and all of these interlocked conspiracy machinations is that no one brings to the table the conversation that all this is taking place in front of an extraordinary reality that every one of those players, and a lot that I haven't mentioned, have all agreed to keep totally silent about, which is the real hidden history of the human species. For the last, 30-some years, it doesn't quite seem that long sometimes, and sometimes it seems a lot longer, but for the last 30-some years, I have been quietly looking at imagery, starting with NASA, then moving on to the old Soviet imagery, and then moving on to the new space programs coming out of the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians. You know, we have a lot of spacefaring nations on this planet tonight, and all of them have had, for some time, the capability to basically blow the doors off the big picture, which is that from those 30 years of studying imagery from NASA, ESA, Japan, China, Russia, etc., I have put together a model as part of our enterprise family, because we have a number of associates who have also been working on this, people like Greg Aaron and many others. The model is that we are living in basically a set of ruins. There was a film many years ago with Katharine Hepburn, I think, called Love Among the Ruins. And in essence, Earth is love among the ruins. When we look out on these images that have been slowly leaking out of these space agencies against the official orders of the guys in charge, we see a developing picture of a stunning, super advanced extraterrestrial civilization that built stuff all over the solar system. And then something happened a long, long time ago, millions, tens of millions of years ago. The closest date that I can put on this solar system-wide catastrophe that changed everything is about 65 million years. Now, if that number is vaguely familiar, that's when the dinosaurs died. That's when the big asteroid supposedly crashed into the Earth and everything changed on the planet. Well, big picture, that's when everything changed in the solar system from a sparkling, vibrant, alive, and electric Type 2 civilization using the so-called Kardashev scale, which Michio Kaku has appropriated on many programs. Kardashev, back in the 60s, working under a brilliant Russian astrophysicist named Shklovsky, proposed there were three basic levels to civilization. Those that would control the energies of their planet, those that would control the energies of their star, and those that could control the energies of their entire galaxy. Now, if you look at some numbers, the steps between Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 are like 10 to 100 billion. That's a huge set of jumps. According to Sagan, my old friend Carl Sagan, when he was assessing this in public many, many years ago, he said that on the Kardashev scale, we weren't even a Type 1 yet. We were about 0.7, meaning that we controlled energies approximately equivalent to that of a planet, but not quite. And the projections are, from all the mainstream folks, it will take us thousands upon thousands of years to learn all the physics and all the science and all the technologies required to harness those extraordinary, prodigious amounts of energy, as well as the beginnings of a process that would turn it into a nutrient source for a healthy global and ultimately solar system-wide and then galactic civilization. Well, what I've been doing with my colleagues over the last, several decades is pawing through, metaphorically speaking, the evidence on these images that someone came before us in this solar system with this extraordinary power and potential and built and remodeled the solar system into whatever its image was of a place, to live for trillions of people, trillions, not on Earth, but off Earth, on all kinds of other worlds, on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter, the moons of Saturn, maybe even as far in toward the Sun as Venus, and maybe even Mercury. We have evidence that there are structures, ancient decaying structures buried in the lava on Mercury, coming from the Mercury mission, the Messenger mission, which was sent up a couple of years ago. The reason I'm going into this backdrop is because what we have now done, or what we have now seen done, is a tipping point in the cover-up of this prodigious, extraordinary history of which the human race is somehow a part. My feeling for a long time has been that against this incredible, splendid backdrop, even in ruins, where we're looking at cities covered with domes that are hundreds, if not 1,000 miles across on, among other places, the moon, when we're looking at entire moonlets that have been reshaped and terraformed is a word which is used about talking in relation to turning, desolate places into habitable Earth-type environments. All of that was done by somebody who came before. And then in some monstrous, extraordinary cataclysm, a catastrophe, it all was washed away. And when I say washed away, I don't mean that literally, because obviously in space there's no, free water and floods, but it was all somehow destroyed in a prodigious cataclysm of unimaginable proportions, which has left nothing but ruined worlds as far as we can see, except for the Earth. The Earth is the only place, the only lifeboat in this sea of desolate and dead derelicts. And when I look at news items of various celestial phenomenon, put out over Yahoo or AOL or the networks for various people, like you're going to see this and this comet come by, or you're going to see this, lunar eclipse, you're going to see this close alignment, opposition, or conjunction. I can't help but think that an awful lot of the objects that are milling around out there in various orbits and, coming and going and visible in various spectacular ways is just the faintest hint, the faintest ghost of the extraordinary splendor of the civilization that actually created and put these things into these orbits, remaking the entire solar system in whatever it was is its image. So what are we all doing here? Well, in the model that, life is very hard to destroy totally, in this huge catastrophe that overwhelmed the solar system about 65 million years ago, in the mainstream model, what that did was clear the dinosaurs away and make room for this little tiny set of, micro rats, these little mammals that eventually evolved up to be primates and then human beings who are looking at the stars and wondering about what's out there and developing very primitive space systems based on rockets and Newton's laws and all that. And we are for the first time looking into space and doing all this stuff. Well, our model is totally, totally, totally different, which is no, we are like children who have arrived after an extraordinary banquet where there was a catastrophe and everyone and everything has been destroyed, and we are picking our way amid the ruins of this extraordinary history that came long before us, of which somehow we are a tiny, tiny, tiny heritage looking out in wonder and in secrecy, because the guys that know that all this stuff is real have kept it religiously and fervently from all the rest of us for over 50 years. Well, into that situation, that status quo ante, which I described the other night, for George, and then a couple nights ago for Robin, something has now changed. The Chinese, of all the independent nation states on this little dust mote in the dark, the Chinese, for some reason, have chosen to go to the moon with an unmanned robotic mission, land, take pictures, and put those images out across the web so billions of people can tune in and download and look at them at their leisure. And B, for some reason, they have been permitted by whatever planetary forces really govern this planet, an amalgam of nations, the hidden hand of the Illuminati, or the Rothschilds, or whatever powers have gotten together behind the scenes and agreed that we'll do this, we won't do that, we'll allow this to happen, we won't allow that, we'll allow these people this much freedom but not much more. In other words, whatever cabal is really running the show, for some reason has decided, I believe, based on the evidence we see so far, to let it begin to all hang out. And the proof is in the imagery I reproduced in the paper I published in Enterprise a couple days ago, with the original links to the original Chinese websites. I mean, we're looking at data that comes from no less an authority in China than the People's Liberation Army. Now, you can't get stronger politically in China than the PLA. The PLA is China. So for the first digital image after 50-some years of the Apollo archive being ignored, for the first digital Chinese image to show us unequivocal evidence of stunning, vertical, glittering glass curtains, geometrically spaced, standing upright in bright sunlight, glistening, 10, 20, 30 miles away from where the Chang 3 Chinese lander landed last December. And for that image to come out on an official Chinese Army website, to be followed by many others and all kinds of other evidence, tells me that we have reached a breakpoint in history, a fork in the road where what we do in the next few weeks or months could literally determine the future of every person listening to this show tonight.
It is that big, folks. And Mr. Hoagland, that in the wake, the presentation of images, as you say, by the Chinese no less,
yep.
In the wake of a statement by the Chinese premier about the their interest in the increased militarization of space. Just thought I'd throw that in there. Interesting.
Yep. Oh, it's all fascinating, and it is. Look, it makes all those shows, those Bond shows, all the imitators, pale by comparison. This is real geopolitical high stakes poker, and nobody visibly yet is admitting what the Chinese have done. But there's been an awful lot of 747s flying around the world carrying heads of state to various meetings, which ostensibly have one reason to exist, and my suspicion is they have other reasons to exist.
You had picked up on some interesting, and I don't want to dominate your presentation or interject.
No. This is a conversation. Come on, Doug.
Okay. Well, I got to tell you had picked up on some very interesting. And as you point out, there are the old saying, there's in politics and in world events, there are no such things as coincidences.
FDR said it back 30 years, in the 1930s, which was about 70-some years ago. There are no such things in politics as coincidence. So when you see this happening, when you see this interesting trail of breadcrumbs being laid out there in a global environment of social media where at the speed of light, any peon, I'm speaking now looking at it from their point of view, can get access to information that would get you killed even just a few years ago. Something big is going on. Something huge is behind all the fuss and fury and nonsense which is going on mainstream news right now, including things that I frankly think of as maybe diversions to keep news people from really understanding what is about to globally shift us under our feet into an entirely new paradigm.
Absolutely. And that's a hallmark, I suppose, of the powers, the globalist powers, is to keep us off kilter and make sure our gaze is affixed somewhere else as opposed to where it should be. But one of the things... go ahead.
There's an old Mark Twain saying that I use time and time again, which is, when it's steamboat time, you steam. I have thought for decades that this moment, disclosure, which is a word which I really don't like, but we'll use it, meaning the unveiling, the apocalypse. Remember, the apocalypse doesn't mean disaster. It means enlightenment. It means knowledge. That the apocalypse would come circa 2012 when the physics of the solar system was right to allow in consciousness this kind of huge leap in understanding who we are, where we came from, and who our great ancestors were, and what we have to do to put it back together again. That you can't do that any old, Thursday. You have to wait for the universe literally to manifest the right energies, the right frequencies, the right background environment, talking in terms of HD physics, that would allow this political and consciousness transformation to proceed on this planet of primitives in a more or less stable fashion. And, then there's the Gallo cliche that I always quote, which is make no wine before it's time. My feeling is that we have been managed toward this moment, not by people who, A, want to get rid of us and want to kill off 7 billion people and all that crap, which is wonderful, exquisite distraction, is it not? It makes you think of the managers as your enemies as opposed to quietly managing for success. But the very fact that these images have been allowed to be out there now for months, and one of the reasons I didn't publish right away is I wanted to see if there was an interstitial fight going on within the Chinese hierarchy that, like our guys, we have over here what Mike Mara and I, who wrote Dark Mission with me, call roosters and owls, which is a term that came directly from Chris, what's his name, the guy who did X-Files, Chris Carter. The roosters are the in-group that want to crow about stuff, want to make it known, and the owls are the guys that never want to give us the time of day or never tell us the truth and never reveal anything. So there's been this tension, this duality in the West, in the NASA program, for instance, between those folks who've been slipping Easter eggs into the data since Neil and Buzz landed on the moon. And I found a lot of them, and Obviously, there's tons more to find because there's been a very small effort and a very small amount of money devoted to this investigation over the last several decades. In opposition to the roosters, the guys that want to crow and make the truth known, you have the owls. And I think Carter took these two animal, memes from the big owl that's in the middle of the Muir Woods as part of the Bohemian Grove ceremonies. The owl that's supposed to represent knowledge and wisdom, and these guys, of course, think they have all the knowledge and the wisdom in the universe. In other venues, they're called Masters of the Universe. That's when they're doing their banking number. The point is that you have this dichotomy between two groups, one that wants things to go on forever as they are, and the other which has been building toward a change to which everybody has to participate. And those we think are the roosters. Well, it looks like we've got roosters and owls in China, because at the same time that the official imagery was being taken on the moon and sent to Earth and then replicated through various news organizations in China and then spread out around the world, what I do in the paper is point out, and obviously you can see this if you read it carefully, the execrable, awful quality in the first couple of weeks of the images the Chinese released of their stunning historical triumph. I mean, who in their right mind would put out screenshots taken off TV screens as the primary mode of introducing the world to your propagandistic triumph of finally joining the exclusive club of the United States and Russia in successfully putting a human artifact on the surface of the moon?
Exactly.
That's exactly what they did. So you got to look and say, well, what's going on here? Obviously, the folks in charge of that image distribution system were told under no circumstances put out anything that would ever give away what's really there. Completely undercut by someone or someone's high level in the Chinese army who put on December 22nd a stunning digital version of one of the Chang 3 images, and it was on that image that I was able to find, finally, an exquisite one-by-one comparison of the ancient crystalline lunar domes left by this extraordinary, powerful, and now extinct ET civilization millions of years ago to companion with what we see taken by the Apollo astronauts and their films, almost 50 years before. When you put them up side by side, which I've done in the paper, they're a match. They're an exquisite match. So you can't wish away, as some have tried to do, that we're looking at electronic glitches in the CCD cameras, or we're looking at noise, or we're looking at, fill well concentrations of electrons that didn't know where to go, and so simply splatter themselves across the lunar sky in these images as noise. None of that makes any sense when you simply compare side by side what the Chinese have given us, what the Apollo astronauts gave us 50 years apart, and see their identical ruins, even though they're located thousands of miles apart in different sections of the moon, because the Chang 3 mission landed in a place called Mare Imbrium, which no Apollo astronauts were able to get to, certainly at 44 north by 19.5 east.
Such symbolism in the numbers. And Mr. Hoagland, allow me to say this. As an investigator of 28 years, I've been to court numerous times and having had to present evidence in court.
You think folks, I would get a jury with this?
Yes. Yeah, unequivocally yes. And I just want to point out, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Richard C. Hoagland is our guest. His website, enterprisemission.com. Now, folks, please, if you're not driving, if you're not doing something about it, if you're by a computer, please log on to or go to enterprisemission.com and click on the Chinese lunar images there and the paper there. It's important to follow along because I've got to tell you, with what Mr. Hoagland has done over the last 3-4 decades with respect to his investigation of artifacts on the moon, this latest, as you put it, Easter egg from the PLA, the Chinese government, verifies, validates your decades of work, and the data, to me, is not only you cannot really argue the data, nor can you argue with the symbolism connected to it, all of which, folks, is so important. Go ahead, Mr. Hoagland.
Well, we have trolls that are trying. I mean, I've been getting all kinds of desperate email, anguish screams from the other side, the folks that are trying to keep this covered up. And it's really amusing to read them because obviously they haven't even read the paper carefully. They don't know that all these questions they're posing, like could it be noise in the CCD, are amply answered by simply referring to the geometry visible in the Chinese images and compare it one-to-one with the geometry in the Apollo images. Now why is that dispositive, to use a legal term? Because the Chinese images are 21st century CCD electronic cameras, the same that you've got in your smartphones and that you use in, your dedicated, cameras. No more, paper, no more emulsions. You're using basically electronics. The images taken by the Apollo astronauts 50-some years ago were on film. They were primitive. They were archaic compared to the Chinese technology. Yet the totally two separate technologies are showing us the same damn thing. Ergo, the thing has to be real, imaged by two separate modalities taking the pictures. So all the critics who say we're looking at noise, they haven't a clue what they're talking about, because noise does not resonantly produce the same geometry spaced almost half a century apart on two radically different sections of the moon.
Yes, that's correct. And it also, I'm sure it's a thorn in the side of those people who have argued that there's no way that we could have, landed on the moon. So, you've got...
There you have now tripped over the next big thing about this. Because what the Chinese have done, remember, we're talking about the Chinese Communist government. We may have forgotten all the duck and cover drills and all the terrors inspired by the east-west polarity of the 50s and 60s and 70s, when we had two huge blocks, the free nations of the West and the communist nations of the East, arrayed against each other, ready to lob 50,000 warheads across the North Pole to obliterate each culture. But I'm old enough, given your intro, to remember duck and cover. And what is stunning to me is what the Chinese have done is to basically affirm, from a totally antagonistic governmental political perspective, that the West, the United States, did indeed land humans first on the moon 47 years ago, I think now, and took photographs of ancient ruins that were then quietly spread around through the culture, and some of them now are being archived on NASA's official sites, which means the Chinese, that antagonistic government, communist government to the so-called freedoms we enjoy in the West, has vindicated NASA's triumphant conquering of the moon, securing of this evidence, and then its censorship for 50 succeeding years. So in one stroke, they have vindicated, and they have basically accused NASA of the most extraordinary cover-up in human history.
The never a straight answer agency, and we know of course, the symbolism that is steeped in NASA, and of course, this, dare I say, this Masonic-like club that exists within NASA, and of course, there are a lot of fine individuals that are part of NASA, but at the higher levels, there is something else going on. But I just find it amazing, the timing, and in addition to you being vindicated from your research, years of research of pointing out there are structures on the moon. Now we're looking, if I understand you correctly, and I've read the paper, and folks, please, enterprisemission.com, download the paper and click through the links. It's imperative that you do that. Don't just look at the pictures. And we've Mr. Hoagland, I got to tell you, I love our audience. We've got a pretty large, robust audience. But one thing about them is they are very intelligent. They're cut above the normal audience, a big cut above the normal audience, and they can discern. They're just great in terms of really comprehending things. So this is why your broadcast tonight, in my view, is so important, because you're going to be connecting some dots that people have provided us over the last several months. Now you're going to be connecting them, because we're in a high-stakes game of international poker here, I believe, with China at the forefront. So go ahead and continue, sir.
Well, I wanted to give people the geopolitical background, because if you don't understand the stage in which this play is being, acted upon, you won't understand what the stakes are and what the implications are and where we have to go. Because the last thing I want to see, and I'll say this right up front, is another space race. The Russians the other day published a very strange article out of RT, which is the one of the official Russian news agencies. And they basically claimed in this piece that the Russian Roscosmos, which is their equivalent of NASA, want to annex the moon. I mean, that was the exact term used, annex the moon, to Russia. I mean, Putin has annexed the Crimea and is looking hungrily at the Ukraine, and now he wants to annex the moon? Well, obviously this has got to be code. The timing of this, in the midst of the terrestrial hoo-ha about the Ukraine and what is Putin's objectives and all that, I almost think is carefully staged diversion to keep news people from really grappling with what the Chinese have done until it's too late to basically spoil the story, to spoil the developments that are going on behind the scenes. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example of more interesting weirdness that comes out of this. Months after the Chinese landing and the release of these images, and again, the Chinese have not held a press conference where they say officially, we found on the moon ancient artificial ruins built by somebody. No, they haven't done that. They've simply put the images out there, and if you don't know enough how to deal with them, how to handle them digitally, which we describe in the paper in great detail, you simply take these images into a program like Photoshop or PaintShop Pro or whatever, and you equalize them. And what that does is instruct the computer to make the lights darker and the darks lighter so that you get some kind of mid-range. And these crystalline ruins are so extensive and so visible that you don't have to do much in the computer to instantly make them visible. It's not like film. I mean, I really had to work with the film copies I was given leaked years ago to bring up what was in the darks, which is this, geometric glass type of redundant, repetitive structure. But on the Chinese images, all you do is hit equalize, and bingo, there it is. Now, you can work a lot more with special programs and curves and light balances and all that to adjust the quality of the glass so that we actually see the geometry, we see the detail, we see the structure, we see how these things actually have architectural form, particularly if you look at the third Chinese image way down toward the bottom of the paper, which I'll be discussing in much more detail in part 2. But I wanted to get enough of this on the record so people could see that we don't have just one shot or two shots. We have more than enough examples taken with 3 different cameras on the Chinese mission. 1 camera on the lander and 2 cameras on the rover. Each of them have sequentially taken images of these glass ruins. So again, you can't go back and fault the technology. You can't say, oh, it was that camera that was having a problem. No, because we got 3 separate cameras showing us the same thing. It's like we've got, 3 separate cameras electronic showing us what the film technology of the Apollo program was actually bringing back to Earth decades and decades before. So the reason this is all intriguing geopolitically is because we're obviously building towards something. I mean, if the Chinese were going to announce that they had found an ET civilization, it would be very simple, either up to now or from this point forward, to hold a press conference, put these pictures up as part of the Chinese government and say, this is what's there. They haven't done that. Why haven't they done that? Obviously, by putting these images out over the web, and making them available to researchers like myself and others, and to millions of people that are just going to look at them kind of curiously, and some of them may take instructions for working with them, and most of them won't have time and will not. What they've done is they've been basically entrained the power of social media to spread this data so far and wide around the planet, copying, and when you download these images, download the website too. Save the website. There's very easy instructions both in Windows and Explorer and Firefox and in Macs for how to save an entire website. Save the websites where you find these images, so that if someone in China suddenly wakes up and says, oh my God, we didn't want to do that, and they try to rewrite history, we have our own version of the Wayback Machine, so we can gently show them, no, you changed history, and this is what you actually put out there. Particularly with that December 22nd image on the Chinese People's Liberation Army website. I want everyone to save the website so that history cannot be rewritten later. The fact that they've allowed us to do this means that part of their strategy is to do exactly what I've just recommended. They want as many millions of copies of these images and these websites to be personally saved as possible, so that when push comes to shove, and if there is an announcement soon, the bad guys can't simply rewrite history and pretend it never happened. Because there are factions and splinters and different, infighting going on within these governments, various fiefdoms weighing for power against each other. So what I see here is a very brilliant Chinese strategy by some group, some faction in China, in the government, to basically get the data out there first, to get it copied by as many millions of people as will see it and download it, egged on by folks like me. And then the next phase will come when there is some kind of public discussion of what these Chinese images and other data really mean. While that's been going on, in parallel, what we have seen is a pattern of geopolitical visitations between the West and China and the Vatican, which I think is very, very appropriate to the level of discussion that ultimately has to take place around all this, which is, what are the religious implications? Because this does not come without huge, huge religious implications. To give you an example of this coincidence of timing, at the same time that Michelle Obama, the First Lady of the United States of America and the wife of the President of the United States, took her two daughters to China on a social, cultural trip, the President was going in the opposite direction several weeks ago, and he wound up in the Vatican meeting with Pope Francis. Now, it's interesting that the press around Michelle's trip said it was not, affairs of state at all. It was totally cultural. She was going to hang out with the First Lady of China. They were going to visit schools, museums, some historical centers, archaeological centers. They made their obligatory visit to the Great Wall, of course. But she was not going to be meeting with the president, the political, senior figure in the Chinese hierarchy. And then suddenly, the first day she gets to China, the president of China appears, and they both go into a room together, quietly. Now, question. Did she carry a note from Obama to the president of China vis-a-vis all this? Or was she there as an emissary to make darn sure that that note handed to her by the Chinese president got back to Obama in the White House at the end of this several-week period in an unscathed and untouched and unchanged fashion, but with total security, so that nobody outside of those three people would even know what the discussion was all about? Meanwhile, in Vatican City, the president is meeting with the Pope, and as is customary in these cultural and ritual exchanges, they each had made up gifts for each other. The Pope, I guess, had some medals struck that were given to the president, and the president, in turn, had a small little wooden box made from timbers from the first Catholic cathedral in the United States a couple of hundred years ago in Baltimore. And in the box there were little velvet packages containing, according to Obama, on live television as he handed the package to the Pope, seeds, vegetable seeds of various species and varieties. And what was extraordinarily resonant to me, I mean, imagine how many vegetables there are on the earth. Got any idea, Doug? How many different varieties of edible vegetables there are?
I'd say at least a dozen. I'm just kidding.
At least, yes. There's actually hundreds. All right? There's hundreds.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Now, before I get to the punchline of the Pope President story, I need to give you one more data point. The Chinese have named their unmanned lander after the Chinese goddess of the moon, Chang. And if you read up, which you can do by going on the links that I put in the paper, the voluminous, literary efforts built around Chang and her scenario, her soap opera, how she got to the moon, how she became a goddess, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You'll notice in part of those stories there is a great discussion about her pet jade rabbit that she took with her. So in Chinese mythology, Chang, the moon goddess, lives on the moon in the moon palace, a crystalline moon palace. That sounds kind of interesting. With a jade rabbit. And what does the rabbit do all day? He's making up elixirs of immortality. In other words, he's doing advanced biology for how to keep Chang immortal if she ever someday comes back to Earth. Lots of multi-level loaded mythology and codes in that little story. So the prime hero of this Chinese set piece is Jade Rabbit, who has taken some of these images of the ancient lunar domes and is doing a lot more measurements that we'll get to probably toward the end of the 3 hours. So the president, flashing back to the Vatican, while Michelle is meeting quietly with the Chinese president half a world away, literally half a world away, the president's meeting with the Pope. He hands him this little wooden box made out of wood from the cathedral in Baltimore, inside of which are various garden vegetable seeds, and he holds up one packet, and he holds it out toward the Pope, and Obama says, and CNN's cameras are there to record it, "I think these are carrots."
Interesting.
And what do rabbits eat?
Well, Bugs Bunny, carrots.
What's up, Doc? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I see this as a tableau, a code being played out in public to where everybody who's in the know can look at this on CNN and realize this part of the plan is going forward the way it's supposed to go. In other words, if you are about to unveil on the totally unprepared mainstream human population of this planet that A, we're not alone, B, we've never been alone, C, we used to be part of some extraordinary civilization, D, I'm losing letters here, it ended in an incredible catastrophe, a war, and E, we're going to pick up the pieces and we're going to do it together, all of us. How would you go about preparing the planet for that kind of stunning shift in history? Very, very carefully.
Indeed. And we know, just from history, and Mr. Hoagland, you're talking to a guy who had listened to you long ago, and hearing you explain the codes, the careful presentation of messages, perhaps wrapped up in things like commercials. I'm still going into Old Navy stores, by the way, and looking. Anyway, that's a story for another day. But you make a very good point here, because isn't this interesting how these messages are conveyed in very methodically, very carefully? Go ahead, sir.
Well, I just find it fascinating that this is all going on in public. Remember, given that they, and we all know who they are, at least amorphously, control everything, if they wanted all this to be done in secret, with only the handful of people, decision makers, power mongers, or power brokers, whatever you want to call them, making the decisions and moving the chess pieces and entering into the next stage of all this. It could all be done totally in secret. We wouldn't have a clue. We wouldn't have any telltale images leaked out there. We wouldn't have any, codes being uttered on CNN that had to be translated. And for God's sake, they would not have landed their spacecraft at 19.5 degrees, which is a ringing, huge, enormously redundant clarion call that the physics we've been looking at is real. It is what is going to determine the future of civilization. And the Chinese are proclaiming by landing there secretly, unannounced, just suddenly setting down that morning on December the 14th, that's the conversation we're going to be having, regardless of who along the way doesn't want to have the conversation. In other words, the fact that this is so public, once you apply the code key, to me is what is so incredibly interesting, the details and the images of the ruins notwithstanding. I mean, I would love to have more resolution, better color, closer in, et cetera, et cetera. But what we got is enough to turn the tables and change everything.
Precisely. Now, I don't want to take you off your stride here.
Go wherever you want to go.
Okay. Well, okay. So the Chinese enter the space initiative. They launch this. They have a successful landing on the moon. Why 19.5?
Well, hang on.
Sure.
This didn't just happen by accident. They've been planning this for decades.
Okay.
Remember, they launched two orbiters, Chang 1 and Chang 2, that went into close orbit of the moon and took lots and lots and lots and lots of high-resolution images of a place called the Bay of Rainbows, Sinus Iridum, in the upper left-hand corner of the moon, if you look at the moon when it's full some night. And yet that's not where they landed. They landed to the east of that area that they had intensively mapped, set down unannounced, changing their mission plan on the fly so that they did not telegraph to anybody that they were really going to go for the gold. But they put a telltale on the Chinese media website, which was basically the home page of the Chang 3 mission. They put two tetrahedra on their website months before the launch, which was a giveaway to somebody in the know that this is what they were planning. And I described the background of that in the papers, so you don't have to remember it. The point is, this is not something somebody just thought up 3 days ago. This is part of a very careful, long-term strategy, I believe, to basically disclose who we are to who we are, and in the not-too-distant future. I'm looking maybe at months, maybe a year, certainly not another decade, and it's all going to happen, I think, because of the way the physics works and the rituals that we've decoded have worked between now and the election of 2016 in terms of the United States. So the fall of 2016, I think, is going to be when this really comes to a head, and we'll be in the middle of a presidential election, and won't that be interesting to see how various candidates sort out something which is not even on their radar, except maybe for one. There's one potential candidate who has a background equal to tackling this, because that candidate has been prepared in meetings going back decades that I and others have documented. And I'll give you three guesses who that candidate is.
Ross Perot. No, I'm kidding around. Would it be Hillary Rodham Clinton, perhaps?
It's Hillary Rodham Clinton, yes.
Yes.
Because both she and Bill, courtesy of Lawrence Rockefeller, had lots and lots and lots of briefings at the ranch, at Rockefeller's ranch in Wyoming, before Bill even ran for the presidency. And there's a guy named Cameron, who you may or may not know, who has tracked very carefully the role of various presidents and presidential administrations in the so-called cover-up and disclosure controversy. You know, discussing mainly the UFO thing, which I frankly think is somewhat of a blind alley. I think there's an awful lot of manipulation in the UFO field that will allow us to never come to a straight answer. That's the beauty of ruins. Ruins stand still. Ruins contain libraries. Ruins contain technology. Ruins contain machine. Ruins contain secrets that you don't have to depend on someone telling you the truth. You just have to do your analysis correctly, and that will tell you the truth. Who they were, how old they were, our relationship to them. I mean, the stunning breakthroughs available in one library, accessible if the Chinese can find it and bring it back to Earth, in the form of crystalline technology or something like chips or, kind of a second cousin to the stuff that we use to store information. There's only so many limited ways to store information in the universe, so that we're going to find it and we'll decode it and we'll translate it. And can you imagine someday seeing video from this civilization when it was brand new and those star scrapers were extending up 20, 30, 40 miles above the moon's surface?
Wow.
Yeah.
It would be difficult to really comprehend what you're saying. But
look at the pictures.
Wow. Well, exactly. Just so our audience, everybody's kind of up to speed here, folks. Mr. Hoagland, of course, if you go to enterprisemission.com, I recommend doing that. Certainly, look at it's right on the top of the site. Go in and study the paper on the Chinese moon landing.
Yeah, there's a banner at the top of Enterprise called "What Did the Chinese Really Discover on the Moon?" Click on that banner, which is an actual photograph leaked by the Chinese of these stunning glass-like skyscrapers arrayed all along the northeast horizon from the Chang landing site. And you simply click on that banner and it takes you to the paper. And then you read, and you look at the links, and you think about it a lot. And you go back and you read some more, and you look at more links. This is big. This is huge. This is a breakthrough in the 30-plus years of this investigation.
And just to be clear, folks, when I said that to me, and looking at this from an investigative perspective, this really is vindication of Mr. Hoagland's assertions for the last, at least for the last 15 years I've been following him, maybe 20, that there are artificial structures on the moon. And now, one of the questions that I'm sure people have, for example, and this is probably because of not really understanding the physics of things. Why glass? I mean, of all things, why glass?
Well, for one thing, glass makes up the majority of the surface composition of most terrestrial planets. Silicon and oxygen in combination produce glass, right? Silicon dioxide. The percentage of silicon and oxygen in the Earth's crust and in the moon's crust is overwhelming. So if you're going to build something, you want to use the material which is most available. Now, it turns out that glass has other properties in a vacuum that is extremely beneficial. If you dope it correctly, if you alloy it correctly with other materials like metals, you can get glasses that fluoresce, glasses that screen ultraviolet, glasses that limit the amount of radiation that you would, experience if you were inside them. If you make it properly, there are certain kinds of glass that I have been sniffing around in the DARPA community and getting nothing but turndowns, very cold turndowns for a decade or more, that literally would be self-healing. In other words, you punch a hole in the glass, and like a biological system, the wound actually closes around the hole, the rupture, automatically. And this is a combination of the material science of glass and an application, a judicious application of some of the physics that we have been discussing, the HD torsion field physics. The point is that to have something which is still there after millions and millions and millions of years under micrometeorite bombardment, because the moon's surface is basically nakedly exposed to space. There's no atmosphere, there's no magnetic field, there's no radiation shield, there's no nothing. So anything sticking up on the surface of the moon is going to be ground down inevitably to a little, level surface, given the background micrometeorite abrasion that has gone on for millions and millions of years. So to have these things stunningly standing erect, even if their tops are obviously broken off and destroyed, means that they're made of something really, really special. And the material science alone, if we or the Chinese or the Russians or anybody could go and bring back a chunk of this stuff and analyze it in a laboratory, who knows what kind of extraordinary technological developments would come from simply analyzing a piece of these ancient crystalline domes.
Wow. That's an incredible thought, or indeed. Now, you had mentioned,
so material
of course,
science is where most advances in science and engineering come from. We're
right.
not really any smarter than our ancestors, but the reason that we can go from here to Sydney in less than 24 hours is because heat-resistant steels and alloys, in jet engines that allow you to have, a continuous several thousand-degree flame for hours and hours and hours in a jet engine to push you halfway around the planet in an airplane. Without those materials advances, you would not be going to and from Australia except by boat. And remember, it was a materials flaw that sank the Titanic. Remember, they used the wrong steel and it got brittle and cold when it was exposed to the water with icebergs in it. And it was the brutality, the brittleness of the steel that sank the Titanic, not actually the iceberg. And on and on and on and on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because it didn't have the right materials to build it with. Well, what's waiting for us on the moon is every possible materials advance, energy advance, biological advance that you can possibly imagine. And somewhere it's replicated in multiple libraries, probably distributed much like our own internet, because that's the only way a civilization can, keep alive. Beyond a certain point, it has to replicate parts of itself over and over and over again, so that if it's destroyed, it can rebuild from what's left.
Right.
So we will find at some point, if it's not, the Chinese or us or the Russians or whoever, we'll find the libraries.
Interesting. Mr. Hoagland, we're at the top of the hour. Hold that thought. We're going to be taking a break here for the next, about 4.5 minutes. Our very special guest tonight on the Hagmann and Hagmann Report is Mr. Richard C. Hoagland, enterprisemission.com. That's enterprisemission.com.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to hour number 2 of this Friday, April 25th edition of the Hagmann and Hagmann Report. We're joined by our very special guest, Mr. Richard C. Hoagland. His website is enterprisemission.com. And one thing my father reminded me and cued me to say was, the lie is different at every level.
Absolutely. Mr. Hoagland, glad to have you back on this side
by
of
the way,
break.
why did you start calling me Richard, Doug?
Well, all right, Richard. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
Thanks for the ability to be informal with you. Really, I do. I feel like I know you. I've seen you in on the various YouTube presentations. I've listened to you for so long. I really feel like I know both you and Robin actually. But like I said, you still have me going with 19.5 and what a fantastic presentation back then with Art Bell. And when you were talking with Art Bell, I mean, you've been talking about structures on the moon now for decades. So this is so incredible that we've got verification from the actual Chinese military website, for crying out loud. Huh.
Well, it presages something to come. I mean, to me, this could have been handled totally differently if the intent was to use it as blackmail. For instance, let's say in the TPP discussions, the Chinese want something more, and they want to use levers to achieve that in negotiating the details of the treaty. Normally, you wouldn't put something this incendiary out in public. You would have a meeting, ambassador to ambassador probably. You'd have a set of images, or you'd have a laptop with the images on it in PowerPoint, and you'd simply show them sequentially, and you'd say, look, unless you do this, this, and this, We're going to make this public. We're going to announce what we've found that your guys 50 years ago found, and then you covered up. And that's not going to make you look very global and democratic, is it? So they could have done this in a very different way, but they're doing it so we're getting to see the moving pieces as the pieces move.
Brilliant. A brilliant strategy. And you know, I read from Sun Tzu's Art of War, and so there's something behind this. You're right, it does presage, it appears to anyway, presage something, and I believe that in a courtroom setting one could sufficiently and efficiently argue that. I think you had this, in one of your recent interviews, called it the politics of disclosure, and I know you don't like that word, but isn't it interesting that we're seeing this? Why now, by the way? Why now? Is it because of the geopolitical situation?
No. I think it's much bigger. Again, we are only given a tiny slice through the window blinds of reality. We've been living in a managed culture for decades, if not centuries. When you look at some of what the Sumerians knew and they talked about, it's obvious that this kind of control of information of a much bigger frame than just this planet has been part of a discussion among some power elites for a very long time, long antedating the space program. What I think is going on is, as I said in the last hour, the physics itself. Remember, we're dealing with a real physics, which is not your grandmother's physics. It's a hyperdimensional physics that is being modulated in terms of energy flows, when things can happen more easily, which groups can achieve which ends more efficiently if they make use of this knowledge, which is basically, I know I'm going to lose some people when I say this, but I'll hopefully get them back when I explain what I mean, a hyperdimensional astrology. If you look at our work over the last several decades, you'll see that we've been able to document that as the planets move around the sun, they change the energy interactions between the various celestial objects, including the Earth on which we happen to live. And I have been taking measurements, field measurements, at various ancient sacred sites with Robin, all over the world, from Mesoamerica to Europe to, we're looking now at the Far East, we're looking at, some places in Russia. And the recurring theme of these measurements is that this physics is real, it has real effects, and it is cyclic in that it is modulated by the flow of energies that happen as various celestial objects careen past and are aligned briefly at certain key angles with other celestial objects, which is nothing else than astrology. This is the missing component from the astrological, the stars and the heavens, influence the destiny of human beings on Earth model. It's a huge step forward. Now, if you know that that's a real physics, and you know that consciousness and culture and civilization can be, shall we say, managed to work certain ends more efficiently at certain times, given the confluence of the celestial arrangement of objects overhead that are aligning in a certain way that basically will allow energy to flow in a more efficient manner, would not you architect a huge geopolitical change on this planet in consonance with those cyclic, scientifically reproducible HD torsion field patterns? Well, the obvious answer is, of course you would, if you knew what you were doing. Remember many decades back when it suddenly became a kind of a mini controversy that Ronald Reagan's schedule was being organized by Nancy, consulting an astrologer?
Oh, yeah.
And everybody was all really torqued off about that. Well, they obviously have no sense of history. If you look at the history of power, if you look at the history of governing, potentates and powers and kings and princesses and presidents and all those people have been running their governments according to celestial portents for centuries, for thousands of years. We just never realized, at least some of us didn't, that they were actually using a real science, which is a science of the interaction of consciousness with the torsion field to do certain things at certain times, because that's when they have a better chance to succeed. So bottom line to your question, I think this is coming out now because the physics is going to make the objective of making it public succeed better now than at any other time, perhaps for the last 26,000 years, one full precessional cycle away.
Gives new meaning to the words, when if the planets align just right. I suppose, yeah. So that there is some. So what you're
measure it. Oh, during the eclipse here that came across Albuquerque fortuitously, which allowed me to go up to a very high mountain, capped by limestone, and measure the effects of the total eclipse. We got stunning readings with the moon coming between us and the sun. Stunning physics readings, reproducible readings. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know that the Chinese mission on the moon, the unmanned Chinese robot, Chang the lander and Jade Rabbit the rover, were very nicely positioned next to a little pyramid at 19.5 degrees on the moon. You can see it in the very ridiculously absurd, dumbed-down panoramas the Chinese released. In the paper, I've actually got a shot of this little pyramid. It looks like a cairn. Well, since I have measured pyramids during alignments on Earth and seen how incredibly powerful a pyramid can be as a geometric shape and amplifying the background field, the ether, can you imagine what power such a pyramid on the moon at 19.5 would exert on the instruments of the lander and the rover during the total lunar eclipse a few days ago, which, of course, as seen from the moon, was a total solar eclipse, with the Earth coming in between the sun and the moon. So I think the Chinese, in their mission, have been telling us the truth about what they're really looking at in all different coded ways, starting with the 19.5 landing site itself.
Wasn't there another component to that landing site in addition to the 19.5? Wasn't there, I don't know, a 44-degree...
Well, as soon as I saw that they landed at 19.5 by 44 north, if you're sending a message to a head of state of the power system, which is arrayed planetarily against you, the West, and the titular leader of that system, the United States, is the President of the United States, and Barack Obama happens to be the 44th president. In other words, this message, this revelation, this disclosure message seems to be tailor-made for Barack Hussein Obama, the 44th president of the United States, who already, as I've tracked in many other venues, has demonstrated some eerily celestial connections that tell me that the rest of his administration is going to be radically different and more interesting and more, how should I say, revelatory than the first few years we've had.
Interesting.
It's all about timing. It's all about timing, Doug.
I get that. I think what we're seeing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we're seeing us managed, the population managed to a certain point in time that was predetermined and pre-planned some time ago, and this is all part of it.
Do you remember in the film, I'm trying to remember the name of the specific episode, and I can't at the moment, but it was X-Files, and it was the smoking man. Remember how he said we found the best way to predict the future is to control it?
Yes.
Well, that's what I think we're dealing with here. Someone wants to control the future, And the huge question on the table tonight for you and your audience has got to be, is this a control for a positive end or a control for a negative end? And I've got my data and my inclination as to an answer, but given what you've seen so far, I'd really be interested in your response to that. And the audience. We are going to get questions, right?
Yeah, we get questions by email. If you want to take questions by phone, we certainly can open the phone lines.
Well, we could do both. You know, we got 3 hours. We can do both. And what I'd like to do is save, as opposed to saving all the questions for the end, why don't we start sprinkling them through? Because I'm sure people right now have a huge number of questions, and rather than let people, you know, kind of forget what went before, let's jump on it right now and then sprinkle them through the rest of the conversation.
All right. That's very gracious of you, and that sounds good. Folks, line up. The phone number is 661-244-9839. This is your chance to ask a question of Richard C. Hoagland. Please be on topic. And also, when you call in, please make sure your radio is turned down, your computer is turned down, so we don't get the feedback as well. And I just want to remind people once again, Richard C. Hoagland's website, enterprisemission.com. Click on the top banner with respect to the Chinese. What did the Chinese find? And, of course, we're talking about structures on the moon. So, you know, line up right away to get your chance to talk with Mr. Hoagland. Now, one thing that I found interesting, as the calls are going to be coming in here shortly, one thing I found interesting is you've got a glass structure, and I heard your previous interviews, and sometimes I think, well, you know, the audience has heard your previous interviews. What kind of structures? I mean, are we talking about the small ones, big ones, tall ones, fat ones, and
well,
the
again,
other part?
Looking at the images, the biggest structure seems to be a multi-leveled, intricately architecturally engineered array that I would loosely call a dome. Although when you think of a dome in science fiction parlance, you usually think of an inverted salad bowl, you know, turned upside down with people living under it. But in fact, a really living arcology on the moon, which is a term that I borrowed from Paolo Soleri from the 1960s, which basically is an entire city englobed in architecture. So you could imagine New York or Los Angeles or Rome or Moscow in a, you know, structure that was enclosed against the outside environment. On the moon, such an environment is essential because the moon's gravity is so small that unless you have some kind of a lid, a dome, a structure with volume, the air simply leaks away. Now, it doesn't leak away all that fast. The moon actually, if you were to give the moon an atmosphere, if I remember my numbers correctly, it wouldn't leak away to the point where you couldn't breathe anymore for something like 2,000 years. Now, 2,000 years sounds like a long time, right? But in the history of a technological civilization, it's a blink of an eye. So obviously, as opposed to terraforming the moon, that is making it, you know, like Earth, where you could walk around outside without any lid, without any domes, without any glass, for a variety of reasons, the architects chose to build very complex mega structures, and we're talking miles high and hundreds or thousands of miles wide, you know, being covered on the surface. And on the side we can see, the near side of the moon, those ancient cities under their domes, which I think corresponds to the dark seas, the so-called Maria, have all been destroyed. And all we're looking at now are remnants of ghostly glass, which has so many interlocking connections that even whatever energies destroyed most of the foundations and the structures on the surface have left huge amounts of material in the sky, like gridwork, like girders, like glass architectural engineering constructs that are scattering sunlight and are faintly visible to cameras that we humans have just recently taken descending to the moon. The amount of lunar landscape that had been terraformed, that had been modified, which had been, shall we say, created to allow civilizations to exist, people to exist in structures and malls and all the usual things we think of when we think of modern civilization. It is just awe-inspiring, the amount of surface area of the moon which appears to have been modified to allow this to take place. And the moon, of course, is only a small object, 2,000 miles across, orbiting this planet. We've looked now at a lot of data from other parts of the solar system, as I said, from Mercury all the way out to Pluto, or at least to Neptune. We haven't gotten to Pluto yet. The New Horizons mission will get there in a couple of years. And we're seeing evidence of this modification of natural objects over and over and over again. Like a number of these comets that come by, I don't think are icebergs at all. I think they're derelict, huge island city platforms or spacecraft that are basically leaking out vital fluids, former atmosphere, oxygen, CO2, when they get warmed by the sun, because they're part of a vast infrastructure that was orbiting the sun as separate objects, a la the work of Freeman Dyson, as opposed to a planet with a civilization living on its exterior, such as we currently are experiencing now. So I think when we really get a handle on the enormous complexity of what's still out there, even though it's in ruin, we're going to be dazzled by the absolute audacity of the engineers and the founders of this ancient Type 2 civilization, of which somehow we are a part. We are their descendants in some form, genetically, culturally, in terms of beliefs, heritage. It's all wound up in one huge knot to be unraveled over time. And again, my predilection is that this is a positive development because of the way it's unfolding. If it was negative, it would be being done totally in secret and we would never have a clue. The fact that we're being let in on it and basically are told implicitly to participate by downloading these images, by recording these websites, by saving everything that's being put out there, means that someone behind the scenes has a big strategy to ultimately bring everybody along in this stunning paradigm shift. And that, to me, is very, very good news.
Very interesting take on the data, the evidence. Very interesting take, as I said, on your findings. James R. from Brunswick, Georgia, in with a question wanting to ask Richard, did the Apollo astronauts, did they see the structures that you're referring to? And if so, why the silence? And if not, why not?
That's a very complex and loaded question. For a long time, given that I know some of these guys and I know how true blue they are and Boy Scouts and all that, it was hard for me to understand why, if they'd seen this stuff, they didn't tell everybody, until you hearken back to the time frame when Apollo went to the moon, which was right at the height of the Cold War. And you look at the politics of Nixon, the politics of Brezhnev, the politics of Red China, and you realize that this stunning development, unless it was appropriately managed by people who were competent to lead such an extraordinary change of history, would have ultimately collapsed into a frenzied, race for who could build better and bigger and more extraordinary weapons out of this science and technology with which to kill more effectively other people on this planet. I think that Kennedy and Khrushchev were trying to architect, and I've argued this with data in Dark Mission, that Kennedy, from the moment he walked into the Oval Office, particularly now through the words of his chief advisor and consigliere, Ted Sorensen, who wrote this book, which I recommend everybody, called Counselor, which is an inside, behind-the-scenes look at the Kennedy years and what he was doing and how he made it to the presidency and what his objectives were. I believe, based on the record, that Kennedy, A, knew what was there, B, authorized Apollo to go get it and bring it home, and C, in the last days of his life, had managed to convince Khrushchev to go along with it and go to the moon together in a united expedition, Russians and Americans, that would have shared the wealth, shared the extraordinary science and technology and materials and God knows what is just waiting for all of us there. And the black ops folks, the dark, whatever you want to call them, the folks that run the world for a very different reason, could not countenance that. They killed Kennedy. They put Khrushchev under house arrest, and history moved on to where, you know, we went in a very different direction for another 20 years before the Cold War eventually collapsed. Now, one can argue that maybe Kennedy was premature, that he was trying to do something that the physics, literally the physics of consciousness, if my earlier statements are correct, would not have allowed to take place, that he, you know, basically got the bit in his mouth and he decided to run away with the train as opposed to waiting the appropriate time to where the background of the solar system would allow the political and consciousness transformation this is going to require to succeed beyond what it would have in the 1960s. I mean, one can argue that till the cows come home, and we will never know. The fact of the matter is that I have now been seeing for at least the beginnings of the Obama administration things being put together in a set piece, in a pattern that indicates to me that this is going to be tried again. And this time it will succeed. And this was long before the Chinese made their move. So when I see the Chinese landing at 19.5 by 44 north, it's like a message to the heir apparent of John Kennedy, Barack Hussein Obama. It's now time. Now, why do I call Obama an heir apparent to Kennedy? Because, unbeknownst to most folks, except maybe me, one of the key people up until his untimely death a couple, 3 years ago, that Obama was very closely consulting with on all kinds of interesting questions, was none other than Ted Sorensen. That is not generally known, but it is easily proven. Once, you know, you let it out of the bag, just go and Google, and you will see they had meetings, they had consultations, they exchanged correspondence. I think Sorensen was basically at Obama's right hand to help architect and complete successfully, this time around, what Kennedy tried 40-some years before, or 50 years before, and it didn't work because it was not time. It was too soon. That's a speculation. Admittedly, I have evidence. I don't have, you know, ultimately compelling proof, but I've got a lot of evidence that lines up that I should not have been, and I was not, to see 44 tacked onto this Chinese landing, because that to me was a sign to Obama from the Chinese, it's now your turn.
Very interesting. And Richard, I've done programs, we've done programs talking about these hidden messages or these subtle messages like that, the numbers, the cutesy code sometimes that appears. And we do know that they talk or they communicate in code. A question from Gary J. here, and this is a rather interesting question because you did talk a little bit about some historical things here. He writes this: my question for Mr. Hoagland is, what information did the Third Reich ever find out, if anything, about the moon specifically, and or space in general? And he asked this because they were the most, obviously, technologically, at least in his view, advanced at the time, given during that time period.
Raises, I mean, another excellent question. You're right about your audience. They're really thinking. This is not a simple answer. We have to go back some decades to the end of World War II and look where we were as a planet at the end of that incredible conflict and why the conflict arose. It's been my position, and I've had interesting arguments with Joseph Farrell. You ever had Joseph Farrell on your show?
No, not at all.
Oh, you should. Oh, you absolutely should. Joseph is a Oxford PhD in theology, which makes him, of course, appropriately backgrounded to begin to look at this big stuff. But he also has a real physics bent. In another life, he would have been a physicist as opposed to a theologian. And he's written a series of books about what's happened during the Nazi years and afterwards. And another gentleman who you should have on the show to talk about some of this is a guy named Richard Dolan, who is an academic from the East Coast, who has basically conceived a thesis which he calls the breakaway civilization hypothesis, which is that the amalgam of old Nazi elements and new plants in various governments around the world, particularly in the West, the so-called West, Europe and the United States, have created a situation where following the war and the top-secret military industrial developments that Hitler was pursuing through certain projects, certain really black ops projects, particularly in Czechoslovakia at the end of the war, under a general whose name escapes me at the moment. It'll come back to me. This general, who was masterminding a whole series of really exotic Nazi physics and engineering experiments, appears to have been on the verge, if not actually have achieved, the cracking of the anti-gravity problem. We've all heard of the Nazi bell, which is part of this story, and there have been leaks with the collapse of the archives around the old Soviet Union, and the fact that various governments like Poland and Czechoslovakia and others have made their archives available to researchers. Farrell, through his companions in Eastern Europe, have been able to document an extraordinary series of very advanced R&D projects that was spearheaded by Himmler and Hitler in the bowels of the Nazi research effort, which not only was looking at mastering a level of physics that makes current technology look trivial by comparison. I mean, a torsion field weapon compared to an H-bomb, a torsion field weapon wins every time, because a torsion field weapon can defuse and make an H-bomb not go off. In other words, we have been living over the last 50 years with the illusion that we were confronting all-out nuclear war between East and West, and it's nothing but a con game, because the technology exists to make every inbound nuclear weapon or every nuclear terrorist device absolutely inert and not even capable of being exploded if you have your hands on the right technology. And it turns out that it was the Nazis at the end of the war, through these black ops projects, that were developing precisely this kind of advanced torsion field technology to make nuclear weapons obsolete even before they were invented, which of course raises a whole question what was going on over the last 40, 50 years vis-a-vis the Cold War, and communists versus free-loving nations in a global potential shootout. Well, obviously it was more of a con game to keep the people managed, to keep them controlled, to keep each side doing what the managers wanted them to do, and not giving them the access to the technologies that would have made them realize that the whole idea of a Cold War and a nuclear confrontation was from the get-go not possible because of what the Nazis had developed. Now, how did the Nazis develop this stunning leap ahead in technology? This is where Farrell and I have interesting conversations, because I look at that period of time in Germany between the 1920s and the 1940s, and I see more fundamental scientific and engineering developments compressed into those few years than any other time in history. That was one of the guys, yeah. I was thinking of General Kalmar. Sporenborg was the guy that was threatened with death, and that's why he leaked everything at his trial. So, getting back to the conversation, Robin just brought me in some notes to take a look at. The idea that the Germans invented this on their own, I find less credible than one of two other possibilities. One is they had access to ancient secret texts. Now, you have already acknowledged that there is an awful lot of ritual coding and code language and mythologies woven together in modern geopolitical history. Am I correct in assuming that?
You are correct, sir.
Okay. That came from these ancient mystery schools, which preserved information from our own terrestrial history from a time when various cultures have risen, gone through a period of their maturity, and then they vanish from the scene and are replaced by new guys. That information that they amass, that they accumulate, doesn't seem to go away. It seems to get hidden and preserved and is useful and used by succeeding secret groups and societies and organizations embedded in the fabric of the constantly changing visibilities of civilizations that come and go. So I believe that one real possibility is that the Germans, particularly the Nazis, particularly the Abernabi, who were tasked with finding all kinds of ancient sources of information and wisdom, like they went to Tibet and ransacked the Tibetan monks' archives and trekked the 140 mule train of crates back to the Third Reich in Berlin, even before the war. In other words, what did they want from the ancient Tibetans that they thought would be useful in establishing their global super race, a la what Hitler's dream seemed to have been? That ancient history, that buried history, those little bits and pieces of real science and real engineering for doing astonishing things, preserved by cultures that had come and gone before, appeared to be a very major part of the Nazi realpolitik. In other words, they made no bones about the fact that they didn't know everything, but they were going to go and find from those who had and carefully stored it away what they didn't know, and they would fill in the gaps, and they would become the super race by doing all of that. The other possibility, which is not an either-or, it's actually goes hand in hand with this, is that members of a real extraterrestrial civilization still remaining from those ancient days have been part of this solar system's history at some low level for a very, very, very long time. In other words, members of the family, not aliens, but ETs, human beings, who were part of this much more ancient civilization and who basically were tasked with overseeing developments, monitoring the developments of the primitive cousins who still live here among the ruins, to see that they don't get into trouble or they don't learn too much too soon. Because can you imagine unleashing us primitive idiots into the galaxy armed with torsion field weapons among civilizations that eschew that kind of naked violence and territorial scheming and all the other ridiculous things humans have been known to do? So it would seem that one of these two paths, or maybe both, that the Nazis had access to ancient history, or they had access to folks from off-world who, for whatever reason, basically gave them information they were not supposed to have. Now remember, if we're dealing with human beings, and we're dealing with human beings simply on a scale of millions of years as opposed to a few 100,000, maybe we're dealing with human beings that are human down to their very core, to where they are also, even if they live in a godlike culture, are not free of various vices, wishes, drives, ego, whatever. And a small group decided to play God with the Nazis and give them information and technologies that will allow them to basically control the planet en route to some other objective. Do you remember an old Star Trek written by Gene Roddenberry called Patterns of Force?
I can't say that I do. No, sir.
Okay. It was one of the early original Star Treks, and a lot of people have, basically ridiculed Gene for even writing it and getting it on the air, but basically the storyline was that the Enterprise crew discovers on a distant planet, on a distant solar system, a culture where one group using Nazi tactics is trying to wield the other opposing group into one civilization, and they've chosen the Nazi model as the most efficient way of doing it. Well, it comes out in the storyline that their culture, their alien culture, has been contaminated by a Federation starship captain who, when he is stranded on this planet, figures that the most efficient way to organize the planet so that they will stay alive and the civilization will develop would be of the Nazi model, feeling that he could pick and choose the positive side from the negative side, and of course the negative side overwhelms him, and that's the lesson in the script that Gene wrote. But I have a feeling, I've had it for many, many years, that given that Roddenberry had access to information that most of us don't have, that he was an insider and that Star Trek was kind of like a tour de force of some of the things we will ultimately discover are real, that Gene was trying to tell us something about the whole Nazi experience that is not as a part of the mainstream history textbooks.
Interesting. Not part of the accepted, well, not part of the known narrative. Yeah.
So if the Nazis had off-world help from cousins, from human beings, part of this ancient civilization that inhabited the entire solar system until some god-awful war really changed everything. In other words, who would care most about human beings and their future in whichever direction you want to project it than other human beings?
Right?
So that's my scenarios. I'm not married to any one of them. I think there's enough evidence to indicate that there are folks flitting around who are not from this world, who have access to technologies that are astonishing and essentially godlike, but who have an uncanny interest in what happens here on Earth. So against that backdrop, you have to ask yourself, if those folks are out there, if they have in fact encouraged a group of Nazis in the 21st century to live separately with their technology that they developed during the war off Earth, some other place in the solar system, maybe Mars, maybe the moon, what are those folks that Dolan calls the breakaway civilization? What are those folks doing in this entire mix, and why did they allow the Chinese to publish this data in the form that they have?
Wow, that's an interesting question, and one of, in the context in which you asked, very relevant, by the way. You have a question from Jeff B. here. We'll go to the phones momentarily. I want to thank everyone for holding, but a very interesting question, Richard. The subject line on this question is hyperdimensional physics and God. And he writes this. He says, I first became aware of Mr. Hoagland's hyperdimensional theories through his website, Enterprise Mission, back in 1999. And something about it really resonated with me in a way that other such theories never did. Join the club, Jeff. Coming from a Christian background, a Christian stance, I'm very interested to hear Mr. Hoagland's thoughts on how God fits into hyperdimensional physics, or the hyperdimensional universe, or if it even allows for God.
Well, it certainly allows for God. My problem with static religion has been that I think a lot of it, in terms of the dogmas and the liturgies and the reading from this text or that text, is very stuck in time. It's like if you don't understand the context when these documents were first created, if you don't understand the technological, the environmental, the cultural, the social, if you are projecting from, let's say, the 19th century or the 18th century to when the various books of the Bible or the Torah were written and by whom they were written, you get to some different places than the conventional mainstream interpretation. In other words, to me, God is ineffable, and the stories are written by human beings of events that were created by human beings, although they may have been human beings who had capabilities and powers and talents that are totally unknown to the current human race. In other words, I'm thinking, and a lot of people are going to be upset when I say this, but I'm thinking that the huge cliff between the stunning, extraordinary, multi-planet, globally, solar system-wide civilization that I'm talking about, the Type 2, and now, is basically the description of the fall. That when that culture went up in flames and incredible catastrophic things happened in the heavens, the celestial war, the cosmic war that we see in Revelation, but I always thought should have been at the beginning of the book, before Genesis, because there are two Genesis in Genesis. I've always thought that, no, when I say always, I mean for a long time, that basically what that is an abridged metaphorical description of our real extraordinary history, with God kind of moving in the dark for people that know more than those who are simply attracted by the words and take everything literally. There's a huge amount of metaphorical comparison and leaping off in our ancient sacred texts, not just the Bible, but in the Hindu texts, in the Sumerian texts, in the Egyptian texts. The farther back in time you go, the more uncertain the interpretation is, which is a indication to me that we don't have the proper context, that we're projecting a pastoral, pre-technological civilization on the folks, for instance, who wrote the Torah, when in fact they were extraordinarily advanced and encoded in those first 5 books the fundamentals of hyperdimensional physics, which can now be decoded for a 21st century application. And the guy who's been leading the research on this is a guy named Stan Tenen, who is a very observant Jew who I believe is living now in Northern California. He was living in Massachusetts, but I think he's now moved to Northern California. He has a website called themeru.org for anybody who really wants to see a much bigger backdrop to things that we have believed and taken seriously all our lives. Meru.org is a good place to start, because what Stan has done is decoded some of the early Old Testament, and lo and behold, we find a hyperdimensional set of clues and numbers and connections embedded in the very description of Genesis.
Wow. Well,
it's a double
we have... Okay. You want to continue with that? Or, I want to just remind our audience, because there will be... our audience is Christian, primarily Christian audience, with few exceptions, but we approach things from a Christian point of view. Now, having said that, we've had authors such as Tom Horn, Chris Putnam, Steve Quayle on, and I think you had even mentioned referenced Steve Quayle with respect to the structures on the moon, given their size.
Well, I mean, let's stop there. Quayle has been doing an extraordinary amount of work on giants, right?
Correct.
Who were the giants?
Well, Nephilim,
yeah.
Right.
But who were they?
Good. Okay. Well, let me.
I think they are our ancestors. The stuff we have found in various parts of the solar system is big, made for big guys. The physics, if you get into the details of the hyperdimensional torsion field physics, the physics determines biology. The physics determines species size, depending upon how it modulates up and down. If you have a solar system going along with a certain level of, shall we say, connection to the physics, and then you wind up destroying more than a couple of worlds in interplanetary war, the likes of which we can't even imagine given the energies that were used and the horrendous effects that would have generated. Once you have pulverized and ejected from the solar system the mass of those planets, the entire physics of the solar system changes to where, yeah, you may have the same genetic code and you may have the same consciousness and you may have the same connection to humanity of before, but you're not going to be the same physical size because the energies, the HD torsion field energies coursing through you and other species in this new solar system will not be adequate to the energies of the old solar system because somebody went and stupidly knocked off a couple of planets and destroyed them and changed the entire angular momentum equation, which drives this level of the physics. So the idea that there were giants in the earth in those days, mighty men of renown, again, I'm saying history, relationship, human beings, but by the time it got down to where those documents were written and passed down to, observant, crowds and populations, the total context of where those references originally came from had totally been lost. So someday Steve and I are going to have one heck of a conversation.
Yeah, we could sell tickets for that, to be sure. But honestly, though, the data points, and if we just look at data alone, the data that you've uncovered, and compare it to, for example, the data Steve Quayle uncovered through his research, and Tom Horn, Chris Putnam, and on and on and on. These are all, to me, pieces of a greater puzzle, and it's, the conclusions might differ, but the data is always in court. You bring evidence to a court. It's a court. It's the evidence is what it is, and you've got the evidence based on your research. This is what it is, and you present the evidence as it is. The conclusions might differ, but the evidence is the evidence. Robert or Bob R. from Idaho writes this, and we'll get to the phones after the break here. Just the way the flow has been. He writes this. I love the first sentence. You might think I'm absolutely crazy. Okay. Okay. That's the first sentence.
Listening to our conversation?
But he says this. I've often wondered if the moon is actually solid, or is it a Death Star, or is it something other than what we think it might be? Could it be?
Yep. Nope. He's right on it. Very good, excellent intuition backed up by some science. The moon is not natural. Now, the moon, well, let me qualify that. The moon is natural, but it has been modified. The data that we have, again, this is NASA data, Russian data, Chinese data, indicates that the top 40 or 50 miles of the moon's crust has been honeycombed with habitations going down very deep. In the original Apollo seismic data that came from the instruments that the astronauts left on the moon decades ago, that have been relaying back to Earth up until the mid-'70s when the instruments were suddenly, for some bizarre, inane reason, turned off to save NASA $300,000 a year. I mean, Doug, $300,000 a year for NASA is like coffee money for a week.
Yeah.
And they turned off all the ALSEP units, all the science stations left by Apollo across the front side of the moon that were giving us very important, priceless data. They just turned them off arbitrarily one day, they claimed, because it was too expensive. What I think really happened is that when the principal investigator of the seismic experiment, they landed several seismometers as part of the Apollo program. They landed one on Apollo 11, they landed one on Apollo 12, 14, 17, I'm missing some in between. Anyway, those little seismic stations running on the moon, when something hits the moon, you get impact waves, you get sound waves. and you can map and chart the structures, geological structures, down to the core, if you have enough data, enough stations, and enough signal-to-noise ratio. And so a long-term listening to what the moon was doing when it was being hit by junk coming in from outer space would have allowed the scientists to build up a 3D internal picture of the moon that would have driven, the science of how the moon formed and when it became a satellite of the Earth and it was part of the Earth, or was it crashed into by another body in the solar system? It was all those normal astronomical questions. Instead, in the 1970s, under a claim, a ridiculous claim to save $300,000 a year, NASA said in the 70s, in the mid-70s, 76, 77, somewhere in there, that they had to turn off this network of science stations because it was obsolete and it was too expensive to maintain, which is, of course, total nonsense, total crapola. They obviously turned it off to hide something, and I think I have figured out what they have hidden, because in some of the last seismic data that was published before NASA suddenly turned everything off, again, we don't know that they really turned it off, they just stopped publishing anything claiming they turned it off. There appears to be the outlines of some kind of deep internal geometry in the moon. Remember geometry. Geometry says intelligence. And I think that what the NASA folks inadvertently discovered were the big, huge, massive engines, hyperdimensional torsion field engines, space drive engines, buried in the core of the moon that allowed the moon to be brought here by this Type 2 civilization, eons in the past, put into orbit around the Earth, because without the moon, conscious, intelligent life on Earth would be, in the physics, impossible. And after it was placed around the Earth in orbit, it was inevitable. And I can even give a date when I think this extraordinary event happened, and it was something like 600 million years ago, a time when, in the geological record, there is this stunning change in life forms imprisoned in the rock, in the fossils, which is the only way, of course, that we learn what ancient life on Earth used to look like. Before 600 million years ago, the most advanced creatures on Earth were little blue-green algae and bacteria. After 600 million years ago, it's something called the Great Cambrian Explosion. Every conceivable genre and family of life is laid down in the fossil record almost like it was 3D printed out of somebody's 3D printer in a garage. There's this incredible magic, almost instantaneously, geologically speaking, step between bacteria and advanced multicellular life, leading ultimately to us. And I don't think that was an accident. I think that was part of the rearranged architecture of the solar system by this incredible Type 2 civilization, who are our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers, regardless, Stephen, how big they were and what they actually kind of look like, because the physics then allowed for much bigger creatures than can exist on Earth now. That's the big picture.
Interesting take on that. Interesting take. Richard,
well,
we're up against the top there. Well, go ahead.
If I'm right, and we've got a break coming up, but if I'm right, and here's the last line, the evidence is on the moon, and the Chinese tonight have an edge in going and bringing it back to Earth.
With that, we will take the top of the hour break and come back for our third and final hour. Folks, you're listening to the Hagmann and Hagmann Report with our guest, Richard C. Hoagland. His website is enterprisemission.com. Check that out for the photos he's talking about tonight and referencing. We'll be right back after these short messages.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our third and final hour of this broadcast of the Hagmann and Hagmann Report on this Friday, April 25th, 2014. Richard Hoagland's birthday, by the way. And our special guest, Richard C. Hoagland, enterprisemission.com. By the way, all of his research, all the data that he's providing to you, he's self-funded. I mean, there's no big institution funding his organization. No, it's done through the purchase. Yeah, yeah. It's done through obviously your book and DVD sales, which a lot of information is loaded there. Richard, I got to tell you, during the break, we actually we're so efficient. We actually took a phone call during the break. You didn't even hear it, but we took it. And the caller actually had a good question. A friend of the show, as a matter of fact, and his question, and this is for you, Bobby. It seems like a Bobby night tonight. This is for you, Bobby. We had said, the U.S. had, you mentioned the impacts on the moon. We had, the United States sent up a hard landing thing that punched into the moon more than once. Is that correct?
Well, no, the only time we've done that was in 2009, toward the end, in October 2009. There was a mission which had been begun under the Bush administration called Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is still orbiting the moon. It's a very complex spacecraft with a huge telescope that looks down and takes super high-resolution images. In fact, some of the images I use in the China paper to show that the Chinese government basically lied about what their little robot was doing when it was supposedly taking a nap. They actually drove over to some of these rocks that are not rocks, but are probably pieces of the glass that fell out of the sky, and they analyzed them in secret under the cover story of a 4-day nap at lunar noon because of temperatures. And the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission from the United States, from NASA, took photographs. In fact, it took a set of photographs on the 17th of February of this year, a couple of months ago, and those photographs are in the paper showing the tracks of the rover going right up to the rocks on the rim of this crater and obviously analyzing them while it was supposed to be asleep. Well, the companion spacecraft to Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was something put together by a group out of NASA Ames called LaCrosse. And that was an acronym which stands for something, and I don't remember what it stands for at the moment, but it's spelled LCROSS. And it was a spacecraft that was basically just a, it was two spacecraft actually. It was a little mini robot that was cut loose from the lunar orbiter en route to the moon, and it was connected to the second stage Centaur rocket, which weighed several tons, even empty. And the idea was that they would crash the second stage onto the moon, and this little shepherding spacecraft, LaCrosse spacecraft, would follow it by several miles, taking images and other data all the way down to the impact, and would give us our first sampling near the lunar south pole of what the moon was made of by impacting it with something big enough to toss up a lot of junk that would then vaporize in the sunlight and would be scannable by spectroscopic instruments on the shepherding spacecraft. That all went as planned, and the elements that the LaCrosse mission discovered on the moon are so atypical of a natural body, of an object that's just a lump of rock in space. For instance, they found large amounts of water vapor, which we expected, but they found equal amounts of the metal mercury, equal in amount to the amount of water vapor. Now, what the heck is mercury doing on the moon? You know, the mercury, the kind of little metal we used to play with when we were kids in school, and we couldn't get over how amazing it was that this metal would flow and make little droplets at room temperature. They found thousands and thousands of gallons of this stuff at the South Pole. Now, what in the world was LaCrosse? They also found a whole bunch of other stuff, including gold, including certain refractive high-temperature metals. In other words, it looks like the LaCrosse impact was into high-tech junk, including maybe pipes or tanks containing mercury, which is part of the drive system in this model for the ancient spaceship Moon. There is if you look in the literature, you'll see that there is an ancient Indian legend about vehicles called Vimana that were supposedly anti-gravity spaceships, and their primary power source, and one of the ways they were able to maneuver was through the use of liquid mercury in the myths. So then we send a 21st century mission to the moon, and lo and behold, it finds as much liquid mercury in some kind of storage facilities at the South Pole as water vapor, which is supposed to be, inbound from comets. So none of the results that we read from these science missions is the only result that you can read from the science mission, because a lot of these papers and a lot of these pronouncements that NASA makes about its results are what we call model dependent, meaning if you have a different model, a different idea, a different scenario for why you're seeing what you're seeing, you can easily fit that into the same equations, the same data points, the same amount of chemistry that you're seeing as a conventional model, except it explains an awful lot more than the conventional model that NASA has been giving to the public for over 50 years.
Okay. All right. Well, the second part of Bobby's question was, would this be consistent with the historical accounts, we'll say in the Indian and Hindu literature, for example, of propelled craft?
Yes. Yeah.
Bingo.
Bottom line,
Bingo.
yes.
Okay.
And the fact that they found this stuff and no one's making a big deal of it, you would think that NASA, given that they want to colonize the moon, and you can't have a colony if you have to drag everything up from Earth by means of rockets, because rockets are so incredibly expensive that by the time you wind up bringing everything up, you will not have any money left to do a program. So what you need to do is to find a way to live off the land. This with limitations, artificial limitations on 20th century technology like rockets, like a Saturn V, or the Space Launch System, which is what the Obama administration is quietly, producing for when it's needed, which will be the biggest rocket created on Earth since the Saturn V. You're dealing with a very primitive level of space propulsion technology. So the more you can find on the moon or on Mars to live on, the less you have to bring with you or transship back and forth, the more efficient and the more doable such a project becomes. The fact that the lacrosse mission, by creating this little, impact equivalent to about 5 tons of TNT at the South Pole, spewed up all of these extraordinary exotic materials, and nobody seems to realize how incredibly, unbelievably unnatural all that is. And it's a harbinger of a technological civilization down there, that this impact ruptured something, and so it spewed out these chemicals and these elements so they could be analyzed by the spacecraft's spectroscopes. The more unbelievable the whole scenario for a natural moon that has not been heavily modified by an ancient ET civilization becomes. So it's only a matter of time until this comes out in the open literature. Again, what I never ever expected, and it really is kind of being blindsided, I never expected that the totally antagonistic Chinese Communist government would be the government that would do this. Now, it may be, if we step back a bit, it may be that the Chinese Communists themselves are being duped, that there is a larger global infrastructure waiting for the appropriate time, with agents strategically placed in space programs all over the world. And when the Chinese, for their nationalistic reasons, did what they are doing, this invisible presence, this invisible power that's been waiting like a sleeper cell for how many years or decades or centuries made its move. And they're the reason why these images officially appeared on the Chinese People's Liberation Army website. And the Army itself has no idea how they got there, because they themselves have been used to a bigger purpose.
Interesting and very thought-provoking, to be sure.
Well, you got to think in 4 dimensions to handle this story. 3 is just not enough.
Multiple dimensions. And folks, let me just remind you, and like I said, Mr. Hoagland, or Richard, I believe we have, Richard, yeah, absolutely. I believe we have really one of the most educated and well-informed audiences in talk radio history. And I think the email questions kind of bear that out. Very, very attuned to what's really going on. Now, I just want to just before we're going to go to the phones now, as we promised, but just understand this: we might come to different conclusions. For example, if you're on a jury, if you've ever seen juries deliberate, it can be acrimonious, and it can be, they can come to different, look at evidence and see it from different perspectives. But the bottom line
12
here is,
Angry Men. Excellent.
Yeah, exactly. I love that movie.
Love
in fact,
it too.
I've got, it's the black and white is just absolutely fantastic. But one thing that we really would be very difficult, if not impossible, to dispute are the findings, your findings, the data points you're talking about. So, callers, let's focus on the data points when and let's be very precise with the questions, so we can get as many calls in as possible. Sure.
I want to pick up on something that Joe said earlier. He quoted a line to me that I've, talked about many times over many years. The lie is different at every level. That was given to me decades ago by an intelligence agent who is part of the in crowd. His history is obscured. His current developments and his current, activities are obscured. He's a genuine person of mystery. But one of the things he left me with when he was giving me certain pieces of information that have gone into creating this or decoding this bigger picture was this tagline: the lie is different at every level. If you're dealing with a series of governments and a series of managerial situations where you have to manage the Earth's population, the last thing you will do is tell them the truth. And in fact, to manage your own people, you will give them certain versions of the truth. So what this friend of ours was telling us is that even among the in crowd, the lie is different. And there are probably very few people sitting at the top who know the big picture, because knowledge is power. And the whole idea of managing civilization on Earth is to keep people fractionated, separated into nation states or corporate states or, Al Capone level states, and to keep them at each other's throats as much as possible, feed them a managed diet of information which has been carefully, censored so that the real stuff doesn't leak through. And it's against that backdrop that we're seeing the Chinese put out something so incendiary, which is real information that everybody can download and take a look at and come to their own conclusion once they know a few basic facts about how images are taken. And we live in a world of Google. Google is your friend. If you don't know something about how CCDs work, Google. Find out how these cameras work and why what we're seeing on the screens is not noise. It is real geometric glass.
And pitted extensively.
Incredibly ancient. Incredibly old.
Yes. And that's one thing you mentioned. I heard your interview on Coast where you mentioned rainbow, and funny, the landing took place well, you mentioned earlier tonight too about the
it's on the
rainbow.
doorstep, like at the front door of the Bay of Rainbows. But again, I think this was very clever Chinese punning, because ultimately they plan to debut an environment where rainbows are normal. I mean, all of these pieces of shattered glass, each one is refracting sunlight differentially. And when you look at that third image down in the paper, look particularly on the right-hand side on these skyscrapers, you see obvious evidence of refraction of glass. Now, part 2 of the paper, which I'll get up, posted in a week or two, is going to have an extensive analysis and comparison of the Apollo images taken by the astronauts of these rainbows, and then the Chinese image comparisons. The Chinese cameras are so much more sensitive and have so much more latitude, that if they will just give us even a few more, and there have been no images leaked now for months from the Chinese, it's kind of like somebody in the government realized what someone else was doing by putting out real data, and so there's been nothing new, even though we know they've taken thousands upon thousands of pictures. There's literally a handful which have been released, and most of those are crap because they were the shot off the screen kind. So the actual data we have to work with is like 4 or 5 images at most, but they tell everything because they were slipped out on official websites, including now from the Chinese Army. We have the stunning glass image that you see at the bottom of the paper is from the Chinese Academy of Sciences by way of an organization in Los Angeles, actually Pasadena, that was founded by Carl Sagan and Bruce Murray, 2 planetary scientists whose names may ring a bell. And they were able to get out of Chinese sources in Beijing from the Chinese Academy a digital image and posted it on the Planetary Society's website, and lo and behold, it has the same stunning crystalline glass structure visible when you do the equalization as the 40 or 50-year-old Apollo film images of the same kind of glass refracting the same kind of rainbows.
And folks, please understand, I mean, this to me, from an evidentiary perspective, validates 40, 50-year-old, however long it's been, imagery with current 21st century technology. So what is being said here was the findings, the data that Richard Hoagland has been working with and asserting the fact that structures on the moon is
This is why this is a big deal. I mean, this is such a big deal that, A, they've proven Apollo was real. And for an awful lot of Americans, that's really stunning. I mean, we live in a culture where since we're not doing anything right now, we don't think we ever could do anything. And so the idea, you know, it's almost like kids of the folks that built the pyramids in Egypt, you know, when their great-grandfathers said, "No, we built those pyramids." You got to be kidding. Come on, guys. You can't, you know, put 2 rocks on top of each other. You can't build a pyramid. Only the gods could have built pyramids. Well, the other possibility is that there were no pyramids at all. It's kind of hard to argue against pyramids when you can go over and kick them. But it's easy to argue against, it's easy to argue against Apollo because nobody from Earth can go and kick, you know, these structures or go and look at the lunar module left on the moon or the flag or the instruments or the boot prints and all that. And they don't believe the images coming from spacecraft because they claim, being carefully manipulated into thinking that the NASA images have all been faked in Photoshop. So here the Chinese come along, a government dead set against ours, a space program dead set against ours, a culture basically dead set against ours. And what do? They, A, not only prove Apollo took place, Americans walked on the moon, but they've proven Americans photographed an ancient extraordinary civilization and then kept this secret to the United States secret agencies for almost half a century.
Amazing. It really is.
It is. It is stunning, wow. And I can't wait to see what happens next. Because this is obviously not the end of the story. It's the beginning.
Exactly. And again, you know, we to work this out to its conclusion, and I know a lot of people will think, well, geez, you know, this could be part of the, as Christians, we're looking for the deception and the deception from above, and that discussion, we get that, we understand that, but again, you know, we're talking now about just the mere verification or vindication, I would say, as well, of your research is very historically important. It's beyond the historically important because I have a feeling this will come out. And by the way, I just can't wait for part 2. And folks, please, Enterprise Mission, enterprisemission.com. You've got to look at the data. Now, with that, let's go to the phones. We don't screen our calls. Callers, be respectful, be polite, be concise, if you will, because we got a full bank. So go ahead.
Area code 530. 530, we're coming to you first. You're live on the Hagmann and Hagmann Report.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name's Anna, and I'm from California. Fascinating show. I have a comment and then a probe. My first comment is
oh my
I
God,
believe
I'm probed on the air.
Well, it's a way out there probe.
Okay.
The first thing I'd like to say is I believe that God put the sun, the stars, and the moon in the heavens for seasons and signs. And I believe that he created man and woman. That's my comment. My probe is, on the 27th, Pope Francis is going to be giving a television presentation when he canonizes these other two popes. And he's going to be doing it in 3D. I would not have called in except that you had mentioned that Obama had given him the box with the timber and the seeds in it, and he seems to be into signs and hidden messages.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be using more satellites than they used for the Olympics to telecast.
Oh, and we have to tape this. This has to be looked at frame by frame by frame after it's done.
Exactly, and like Nathan Leal, how he did the
Super Bowl halftime.
The Super Bowl, exactly. Thank you.
Right.
And so I'm not going to watch it because I feel that it could be a subliminal or audio message that I don't particularly wish to receive. But I was wondering if I could probe your mind on what you think about that. And if
so
you wish to find the information, you can go to Pope Francis 3D, and it pops up with multiple things that they're doing to get ready for it.
Well, obviously, I think there's no problem with watching it. I don't think, if you know who you are and you have a firm faith, you will not be affected by what comes through the screen, but you're going to want to see patterns. You're going to want to see the way the information is presented. You're going to want to look at the shots. You're going to want to look at juxtapositions of shots. Do you remember something really bizarre that happened recently that just got quietly swept under the rug that I think had a very large message component and yet no one followed up on it in the mainstream? Remember when Nelson Mandela's funeral took place in South Africa?
Oh, yes, I remember, with the leopard skin over it and just a few people there, and it was like looking through a stone.
And then you had the translator, the sign language translator, who turned out to be total nonsense.
Yes.
And he was allowed to go through this for hours. No one vetted him. No one figured out that he was a con artist, that he wasn't for real. Or was it deliberately made part of the process to have a meta message, which is, this is not what you think it is? So when you look at these global television extravaganzas, you should not look away. You should tape and watch everything and be asking all kinds of questions, certain in your faith and in the knowledge of who you are, you can come up with answers, and then we all compare our answers.
That's a very good point. I just try very hard to restrict my exposure to non-godly things.
Well, but to me, God triumphs over everything, so I'm not going to be watching this fearful.
That's a good point.
Thank you, caller. Very, very well orchestrated question. Very well said. And that 3D is really important. Richard, about that 3D? What is with that? What is with that? The 3D, broadcasting 3D.
You can look at it two ways. You can look at it as just another step in the technology of image transformation. We relate to three-dimensional imagery, so there's a group of people, technicians and management and corporations and nerds and hackers and all those techie people that love to play with this stuff that want to give us a better and better simulation of reality. So 3D is where you would go with that. The other aspect of looking at it would be another level message. In other words, if you're putting all this attention and effort into a multi-dimensional presentation, maybe the message is it's a multi-dimensional reality that you're trying to represent with a multidimensional presentation. So, yeah, thank you, Ann, for this. We have got to put this on our calendars. I think she said the 27th, which is...
Correct.
Is that Sunday? Is that this coming Sunday?
That is correct.
So, yeah, everybody in this audience should be taping and looking and comparing notes. And if we see anything interesting, I'll give you a holler, Doug, and I'll come back on and we'll do kind of cliff notes on what was really going on.
Would love it. And boy, we do hope you come back on as well, even if nothing happens or nothing of significance happens there.
You know something's going to happen. It's just how smart are we to see it? That's why you need lots of eyes looking and lots of people comparing notes. And that's where social media comes in. That's the genius of the Chinese putting these images out through social media with millions and millions and millions of people copying, because there's no way this feather pillow can have the feathers dumped back into it on the doorstep. It's out there now, and it can never be retracted.
The old genie in the bottle. You can't put the genie back in the bottle.
All right, let's go to another call. We're going to go to area code 610. 610, you're up next. You're live on the Hagmann and Hagmann Report with Richard Hoagland. What's on your mind tonight?
Hello, gentlemen. My name is Max Kasich, also known as Max the Knife. I'm from Philadelphia, PA. Happy birthday, Professor.
Thanks, Max.
I read your paper, and I thought using LRO to prove the rabbit went up to the rocks was genius. And the rest is...
Wasn't my idea. It was their idea.
Excuse me?
Max, hang on. Don't you find it really amazing that we have those images?
Oh, yeah.
Why do we have those images?
Because it's time?
No, it's because somebody in the LRO system is part of the same...
the LRO. I thought you were talking about the rabbit, yeah.
No. I'm talking about multiple... This is beyond nationality. This is like a global system that's decided now is the time to make this public and to provide counterpoint information to where the government of China claims one thing, the NASA satellite imageries prove something else, and you put that together with the Chinese leaks of the real data. In other words, this is a global system to empower us as opposed to a global system to put us in further bondage.
Oh, I totally agree.
And it's a very positive spin. I see nothing but positives as to what's happening and what's going to happen.
I agree, and what I also see is the pyramidal structure. I mean, don't you think that ultimately the top...
Wait till you see the better images we've got.
Okay, anyway, congratulations.
Part two.
I think it's all vindication. And it was also exciting to hear about your potential trip to Russia for the potential award.
Yeah, I need to figure out how to handle that politically in a way that it makes it positive as opposed to simply acceding to Putin's, megalomania. And
I agree.
I think I figured out a way to do that. Which if we can make it all work, and I've got to obviously pass it through some other people. I have to send them the paper. I haven't done that yet. I've been a little busy the last couple of days.
Right.
But I'm going to do that, and fortunately we got enough time, if we're going to go do this, to do it right, and to basically use this as a statement to point out, as Kennedy did to Khrushchev, this is too big for both of us. We got to do this with everybody.
I agree, and I'd love to assist you. If you need a second assistant to Robin, I'd be happy to come out and help.
Okay.
Well, anyway, I have two questions. I'm sorry, I had two
ahead.
questions that I prepared. And the first question is, do you think that Flight MH370 plays into all of this?
Oh, my God, Max. I was afraid somebody would go there.
Yeah,
Look,
I'm sorry. I had to because it's been on my mind, and all the guys at work are always talking about it.
We have 239 families who have gone through hell over the last 6 weeks, 7 weeks, whatever. I do not want to add to either their distress or give them false hope.
I agree.
But all I can say is, as I looked at how this mystery around Flight 370 has unfolded, and I looked at who were the primary passengers on that Malaysian aircraft, which were not Malaysians, they were Chinese.
Right.
If I was trying to send the Chinese a meta message that you will not do what you're planning to do,
exactly
this
my thought.
mystery which really is a mystery at all different levels and has got a lot of people very afraid and confused on the inside. I refer you to the interview that the Malaysian Prime Minister did with the CNN correspondent last night, where he basically admitted they've got a report that he's going to make public, but that it's not going to make people happy, because there is a fundamental mystery underlying this whole thing that doesn't make any sense in any real world geopolitical extrapolation. It doesn't fit the terrorist model. Right? It doesn't fit the terrorist model. It doesn't fit the accident model. You don't have an airplane with critical damage flying for 7 hours. It doesn't fit anybody's known model.
How about Richard Dolan's model?
Well, let me get to Dolan's model, okay. which Joseph Farrell has actually done some discussion with on his blog, which is, I recommend to everybody, just Google Dr. Joseph Farrell and find his website, which is Giza something or other. Anyway,
the power plant.
The idea that somebody has intervened to attempt to stop the Chinese from proceeding down this path, and they did it in a way that puts the fear of God into everybody participating in the search and rescue and the efforts to even they even found as much as a fleck of paint from this thing over 7 weeks. Well, I just put these two incomparable events together side by side, and my intuition says there is some potential connection. Now, what that means in terms of the hopes of the families, I don't know. What it means in terms of the geopolitical discussions going on behind the scenes, government to government, I don't know. I just know that there's a tremendous effort being deployed in the South Indian Ocean off Australia to find an airplane when there's a lot of other things that we need to worry about in the same time frame that are going on, like what's going on with the Ukraine, what's going on with North Korea and their obsession with developing atomic weaponry. So, yeah, I'm looking at that, Max. I don't know where to come down, but just common sense says you can't have something that unbelievable happen right after the Chinese have done something unbelievable and not have a possible, deeply hidden connection.
I totally agree. Totally.
And we'll leave it there.
All right, my second question, and it's pretty broad, but what role do you think Cydonia might ultimately play?
Well, obviously, ultimately, we're going to Cydonia with all this. Remember, the moon is just a stepping stone to what's really out there. And when I look at what the Curiosity rover has been finding and publishing, more and more obvious artifacts, more and more junk, more and more evidence of a mega arcology in Gale Crater, eventually the Martian side of the story is going to come into its own, and that may be beginning in October, around October 19th, when Comet Sighting Springs makes a very, very close approach to Mars. And it looks to me like NASA is preparing by putting enough on the record so that when it all blows up in their face that they've been hiding all this for decades, they can turn around and point to the Curiosity imagery and say, no, we haven't, it's right there. See? It's there. So there appears to be a larger meta component to this strategy for disclosure, and the only thing up for grabs now, I think, is the time frame. I don't know whether it's going to be 3 years, meaning 2016 is when we're all going to find out, or whether it's going to come out in dribs and drabs and somebody is going to be forced to admit what's really going on much sooner. But I see an unstoppable train leaving the station and creating certain reactions in the public news cycle that, if you look carefully, cannot be explained in any trivial fashion.
Terrific. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your call. Very good questions indeed. I have an email question here for you, Richard. This from Brian T. This appears perhaps a quick answer to this. Thank you for having this guest on tonight with a different perspective and different worldview. Could you speak, you Richard, can you speak to the monolithic structures spoken of by Buzz Aldrin on Phobos?
Well, Max just mentioned Mars. Mars is part of this global Type 2 civilization that we've been positing. If you go to Enterprise and you look for the words Phobos, Phobos, in a banner, you'll find a two-part paper that I wrote some years ago on the artificiality of the two moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, as evidenced by the Mars Express observations from Mars orbit managed by the European Space Agency. And when Aldrin got the ear of the president, of Obama, a few years ago on a flight from Washington to the Cape, where the president was going to make a speech enunciating a whole new direction for NASA, Aldrin actually hitched a ride from Washington to the Cape with the president, and in all the photographs we have, you have Buzz clutching this little plastic model of Phobos. And when he appeared on CNN and other, morning talk shows, including C-SPAN, on the anniversary of the moon landing, which was, I think, the 44th anniversary, instead of talking about the moon and what they had done and what they'd seen and all that, Aldrin kept talking about Phobos and how there was a monolith a la 2001 on Phobos. All of which is true. There is a monolith on Phobos, and it looks very out of place. It looks like some ancient pre-current civilization, but much younger than the millions of years old Type 2 placed it there as part of a reconnaissance of exploration by succeeding civilizations before we get to ours, and that Aldrin was having these little private discussions with Obama relating to what was on Phobos, what it means for the bigger picture of what's on Mars, what that means for the bigger picture of what's in the solar system, and what that means hooked into whatever he told him privately that he remembered from being on the moon in Apollo 11 and walking under these stunning architectural wonders that are almost invisible in the sunlight, that are the remains of something that is so awe-inspiring that it's still present even after umpteen millions of years. Again, that's all speculation based on the fact that Aldrin himself made a big deal of this monolith on Phobos. And at one point in his interview with C-SPAN, he says, well, you can speculate who made it. He said, you might ultimately say that God made it, which I thought was one of the most interesting ellipses in modern interviewed television.
Dare I ask why? The significance of that when you say he said that God made it?
He's talking about godlike power.
Oh, I
see.
Okay.
Yeah. And remember, before the fall, we had godlike power, did we not? So these metaphors, these recurring metaphors, keep coming up in the most strange connections and allusions and comparisons.
Interesting indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Richard C. Hoagland, enterprisemission.com. Let's go back to the phones. And here we go.
Area code, let's see here, area code 515.
515, what's your question for our guest? You're up.
How you guys doing,
515. Good, very well. What's your question,
sir? My question is, I have heard recently, I can't remember if it was Jim Garrow or I think it was Jim Garrow with Dave Hodges, saying that Obama had been picked somehow for disclosure. And I found the visit with the little gift to the Pope and the carrot seeds or whatever they were interesting. Does your guest tonight think that some of the stuff that has been said about the telescope on Mount Graham that Tom Horner and Chris Putnam and others speak about, and I'll hang up to hear his response. Just wondering if he thinks there's some validity there.
Which part do you ask about the validity? That Obama is part of disclosure?
Yes, Obama being picked somehow to disclose this stuff, and then whether there is.
I don't think. Let me interrupt you there, and then we'll go on to part two. I'm
Okay.
not sure that that Barack Obama himself was picked. I think it was a number of people were groomed to be the 44th president of the United States, and it's who would become the 44th president who is the
Gotcha.
guarantor of this disclosure process as opposed to the man himself. I think that Barack Obama found himself in an extraordinary position, did not plan to find himself in that position, and for the last several years has been trying to figure out what to do from that position, giving out various clues that I have been trying to quietly, take note of and correlate and all that in an effort to figure out what's up ahead. But I think the Chinese kind of put it right on the front page by putting a spacecraft at 44 North that finds ancient ruins on the moon, because it's kind of hard to deny now that the 44th president has some crucial role to play in what happens next.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So what was the next part of your question?
The next part of my question, I guess, sir, is I'm not sure if you're familiar with Exo Vaticana, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam's book about the Vatican telescope up on Mount Graham, and Guy Consolmagno, I'm probably butchering his name, and I think last week Chris said there was even some statements released that something big, some kind of big announcement is coming from the Vatican, I think is what I understood him to say.
I'd like to see that documented.
Okay.
And if there's any more intel as to what the announcement might be. I mean, we've been watching the Vatican very carefully. I think that the recent resignation of one pope and the ascension of another, who just happens to be a Jesuit, is not accidental. I think that there are definite players in this disclosure, because remember, if you have 1 billion Catholics and they're all going to freak out about we're not alone, the only force that can basically make them take a second look and calm down and listen carefully and watch carefully is someone in authority, a father figure for whom their entire religious experience has taught them will tell them the truth, and that is none other than the Pope. Now, the Pope has a lot of influence beyond Roman Catholics. There's an awful lot of other people on the planet who look to the Vatican for spiritual guidance, to look to individual members of the clergy for personal as well as larger issues of spiritualism and salvation. And so the Pope, in this time of extraordinary change, has got to be a player, which is why I say again, everybody should tape and watch carefully the canonization this Sunday, apparently, by Pope Francis of his predecessors, because I have a feeling there's an awful lot of information that's going to be coming out in symbolism, in the liturgy, between the lines, in the very imagery, in the juxtaposition of imagery. In all ways, this is something that we cannot ignore, and we should take careful notice of and then compare notes.
I agree. Well, thank you for your response, and I'm going to hang up so you guys can keep going.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for the call.
And by the way, Richard, we here at the studios will be recording that in high-def video as well for archival purposes. Yeah, you had mentioned that, and a lot of our guests are. We know the symbolism. I mean, we know that there's symbolism going on, the code speak going on. And by the way, it's interesting you mentioned the number 44, the 44th president, regardless if it was Obama or Hillary or Romney, whoever it might have been. What's the significance of that?
Well, that's a good question, and I frankly don't have a very good answer yet, because I've been thinking about it a lot. One obvious possibility is it's 4 times 11. 44 is 4 times 11. What people don't know is that 11 and all the permutations thereof, 11, 11, 11, 11, 11, 11, run out the number, is a mathematically coded replication of 19.5. So by landing at 19.5 by 44, what the Chinese did was to underscore the hyperdimensional aspect of the message they were trying to communicate by landing on the moon at all. Now, 4 times 11 could indicate 4th dimension, if you're dealing with hyperdimensions. 4th dimensional reality could be the equivalent in the Roman Catholic liturgy of purgatory. When a person dies, your soul does not go directly to wherever it's supposed to go. It kind of hangs around someplace. We're not quite sure. I was a Roman Catholic, so I can tell you something about the catechism. The idea is that you go through this place called purgatory. Well, maybe in the physics, purgatory is a 4th spatial dimension, which is inaccessible under normal circumstances from R3, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that Obama as the guy is as important as Obama as the symbol of the 44th president. Because remember, he came out of nowhere. It was supposed to be Hillary. Remember?
Until that meeting in Virginia, it was, it was.
And there was a very interesting little thing with a Roman Catholic priest in Chicago, whose name I forget, somebody will tell you. And he did a whole parody of her being upset as all get out that this black guy nips in just under the wire and snatches the prize away from her, who was supposed to belong to.
Correct.
And
yes.
Then there was a scene in the Oval Office when President Bush gathered the ex-presidents who were in good enough health to come to Washington. I think it was his father, it was Jimmy Carter, it was Bill Clinton, Obama. I don't think Ford made it because he wasn't in good enough shape to fly to Washington. But anyway, they had this little meeting of all these ex-presidents, and in the middle of the meeting, Clinton looks down at the Oval Office floor, and on camera he says to George Bush Jr., W., he says, "I've always liked this rug." So that, of course, immediately got me very intrigued, so I started doing a whole investigation on the history of the Oval Office redecorations and the White House rug. And it turns out that George W. had been extolling the virtues of that rug for his entire presidency. And when I counted the symbolism of the rays, because it was basically an oval which fit in the floor plan of the Oval Office, with the sun in the center with the rays going out in every direction. And the sun represents Horus, which of course is the Egyptian sun god, which is a very high-level esoteric representation of the American presidency. The American presidency is Horus, and that's a whole long separate show. Anyway, when I counted the number of rays coming out of this rug, that Clinton said that he'd always loved that rug of Bush, I realized there were 44 rays, meaning that George Bush sat on that rug, which was really his successor's rug, and the reason that Bill loved it is it was supposed to be Hillary's rug. And Obama came in from nowhere and snatched the prize away, and I think against the backdrop of what's really going to happen, the incredible enmity being directed toward this man, Barack Hussein Obama, in part is by the elites behind the scenes that know what's happening, and they wanted their guy or their gal in there to manage and manipulate the future, and there's someone in there who to them is not legitimate and who's going to do damn well whatever he pleases and maybe not be part of a prescribed ritual or reaction to what the Chinese are doing. And that's why the Chinese sent him a personal message at 44 by 19.5.
Certainly, I've got to admit, it certainly broadens one's perspective, gets you thinking. Indeed, Richard.
There needs to be a lot of much bigger thinking on the political landscape than I've seen over the last 8 years.
Absolutely, I agree with you on that, Richard. I got to tell you, we're out of time. I can't believe 3 hours has gone so fast.
Already?
We're out of time. Can you believe it? I want to say this. I want to thank you very much for your very dedicated hard work, everything you've done, and equally important, I want to thank you for sharing your time with us on your very special day, taking 3 hours out to talk with our audience. It's been a very distinct pleasure. And
well, Doug, my pleasure.
I would hope that you would come back, again, on a routine basis to kind of fill us in on your findings, because I think they're fascinating.
Well, when there's news, give me a holler and we'll do something.
Very well, sir. All right.
And
very good.
Thank
you, sir. All right. You have a good night.
Everybody have a great weekend.
You too.
All right. God bless.
Thanks, Richard.
All right. Fantastic.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. What a great program. What a lot of fantastic information. Look at the data, folks. And the only thing I'm going to say in closing is just look at the data. Read the paper and think think bigger. Think bigger. You don't have to agree with Richard Hoagland's conclusions. I certainly didn't agree with them all. Joe didn't agree with them all. But the data.
Very interesting things that he's mentioned in there, yeah.
Yeah, but the data fits in there.
Yeah, there are some things in there that he did surprise me with. Okay. And with that, we're up against the very end of the show. Everybody have a safe weekend. We will be back here Monday, 8 p.m., and we might and will most likely have a guest. Check the website during the weekend to see if there's any update on that. With that, we'll see you then. God bless, stay safe, and have a
Well, our special guest tonight, by the way, it is his birthday, and we're so honored that he would take time out of his busy schedule.
And you're making me feel very old.
Oh, heck. Yeah. Old or wise and experienced. I think it's probably the latter. You are to be congratulated. But ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know who this gentleman is, this is Richard C. Hoagland. He's a former NASA consultant and science advisor to CBS News and to Walter Cronkite. What Mr. Hoagland has for us tonight is incredible. His research has borne fruit. Now, before I bring him on, let me just say this. We talk all the time about the New World Order, about the Illuminati, about the plans, the big picture. If you read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, and this is relevant to tonight, folks. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. If your enemy is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he's superior in strength, evade him. If your opponent is temperamental, seek to irritate him. Now, folks, remember these words as the program unfolds tonight. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. If he's taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. If sovereign and subject are in accord, put division between them. Attack him where he is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. Now, folks, please remember that. Also, remember all of the programs that we've done here this year, last year, and in the context of our guest, what he's about to reveal and present on this program. He's already revealed this on Coast to Coast, and also Dr. Robin Falkov's program as well. But what he's about to talk about tonight, I think, is critical, and is Mr. Hoagland's 4+ decades of experience. His research has been vindicated by recent events, and we'll let him explain it to you. But with that, Mr. Hoagland, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, Doug, I don't know quite what to say after that intro. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm going to address, one of you is Doug and the other is Joe, right?
That's correct. The young pup is Joe. I'm Doug. And,
I'm everybody.
Yeah, I'm the verbose one. So,
okay.
All right. So.
Well, all right. You actually mentioned it in your intro. This is a big picture conversation. In fact, you can't get much bigger than this. The thing that constantly annoys me about the conversations that people have about the Illuminati and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the East versus West and the strange group that Pulford is talking to and all of these interlocked conspiracy machinations is that no one brings to the table the conversation that all this is taking place in front of an extraordinary reality that every one of those players, and a lot that I haven't mentioned, have all agreed to keep totally silent about, which is the real hidden history of the human species. For the last, 30-some years, it doesn't quite seem that long sometimes, and sometimes it seems a lot longer, but for the last 30-some years, I have been quietly looking at imagery, starting with NASA, then moving on to the old Soviet imagery, and then moving on to the new space programs coming out of the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians. You know, we have a lot of spacefaring nations on this planet tonight, and all of them have had, for some time, the capability to basically blow the doors off the big picture, which is that from those 30 years of studying imagery from NASA, ESA, Japan, China, Russia, etc., I have put together a model as part of our enterprise family, because we have a number of associates who have also been working on this, people like Greg Aaron and many others. The model is that we are living in basically a set of ruins. There was a film many years ago with Katharine Hepburn, I think, called Love Among the Ruins. And in essence, Earth is love among the ruins. When we look out on these images that have been slowly leaking out of these space agencies against the official orders of the guys in charge, we see a developing picture of a stunning, super advanced extraterrestrial civilization that built stuff all over the solar system. And then something happened a long time ago, millions, tens of millions of years ago. The closest date that I can put on this solar system-wide catastrophe that changed everything is about 65 million years. Now, if that number is vaguely familiar, that's when the dinosaurs died. That's when the big asteroid supposedly crashed into the Earth and everything changed on the planet. Well, big picture, that's when everything changed in the solar system from a sparkling, vibrant, alive and electric Type 2 civilization using the so-called Kardashev scale, which Michio Kaku has appropriated on many programs. Kardashev, back in the 60s, working under a brilliant Russian astrophysicist named Shklovsky, proposed there were three basic levels to civilization. Those that would control the energies of their planet, those that would control the energies of their star, and those that could control the energies of their entire galaxy. Now, if you look at some numbers, the steps between Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 are like 10 to 100 billion. That's a huge set of jumps. According to Sagan, my old friend Carl Sagan, when he was assessing this in public many years ago, he said that on the Kardashev scale, we weren't even a Type 1 yet. We were about 0.7, meaning that we controlled energies approximately equivalent to that of a planet, but not quite. And the projections are, from all the mainstream folks, it will take us thousands upon thousands of years to learn all the physics and all the science and all the technologies required to harness those extraordinary, prodigious amounts of energy, as well as the beginnings of a process that would turn it into a nutrient source for a healthy global and ultimately solar system-wide and then galactic civilization. Well, what I've been doing with my colleagues over the last, several decades is there and developing very primitive space systems based on rockets and Newton's laws and all that. And we are, for the first time, looking into space and doing all this stuff. Well, our model is totally different, which is, no, we are like children who have arrived after an extraordinary banquet where there was a catastrophe and everyone and everything has been destroyed, and we are picking our way amid the ruins of this extraordinary history that came long before us, of which somehow we are a tiny, tiny, tiny heritage, looking out in wonder and in secrecy, because the guys that know that all this stuff is real have kept it religiously and fervently from all the rest of us for over 50 years. Well, into that situation, that status quo ante, which I described the other night, for George, and then a couple of nights ago for Robin, something has now changed. The Chinese, of all the independent nation states on this little dust mote in the dark, the Chinese, for some reason, have chosen to go to the moon with an unmanned robotic mission, land, take pictures, and put those images out across the web so billions of people can tune in and download and look at them at their leisure. And B, for some reason, they have been permitted by whatever planetary forces really govern this planet, an amalgam of nations, the hidden hand of the Illuminati, or the Rothschilds, or whatever powers have gotten together behind the scenes and agreed that we'll do this, we won't do that, we'll allow this to happen, we won't allow that, we'll allow these people this much freedom but not much more. In other words, whatever cabal is really running the show, for some reason has decided, I believe, based on the evidence we see so far, to let it begin to all hang out. And the proof is in the imagery I reproduced in the paper I published in Enterprise a couple days ago, with the original links to the original Chinese websites. I mean, we're looking at data that comes from no less an authority in China than the People's Liberation Army. Now, you can't get stronger politically in China than the PLA. The PLA is China. So for the first digital image after 50-some years of the Apollo archive being ignored, for the first digital Chinese image to show us unequivocal evidence of stunning, vertical, glittering glass curtains, geometrically spaced, standing upright in bright sunlight, glistening, 10, 20, 30 miles away from where the Chang 3 Chinese lander landed last December. And for that image to come out on an official Chinese Army website, to be followed by many others and all kinds of other evidence, tells me that we have reached a breakpoint in history, a fork in the road where what we do in the next few weeks or months could literally determine the future of every person listening to this show tonight.
It is that big, folks. And Mr. Hoagland, that in the wake, the presentation of images, as you say, by the Chinese no less,
yep.
In the wake of a statement by the Chinese premier about the their interest in the increased militarization of space. Just thought I'd
yep.
throw that in there. Interesting.
Yep. Oh, it's all fascinating, and it is. Look, it makes all those shows, those Bond shows, all the imitators, pale by comparison. This is real geopolitical high stakes poker, and nobody visibly yet is admitting what the Chinese have done. But there's been an awful lot of 747s flying around the world carrying heads of state to various meetings, which ostensibly have one reason to exist. And my suspicion is they have other reasons to exist.
You had picked up on some interesting, and I don't want to dominate your presentation or interject.
No. Well, this is a conversation. Come on, Doug.
Okay. Well, I got to tell you had picked up on some very interesting, and as you point out, there are no the old saying, there's in politics and in world events there are no such things as coincidences.
FDR said it back 30 years, in the 1930s, which was about 70-some years ago.
Exactly.
There are no such things in politics as coincidence. So when you see this happening, when you see this interesting trail of breadcrumbs being laid out there in a global environment of social media where at the speed of light, any peon, I'm speaking now looking at it from their point of view, can get access to information that would get you killed even just a few years ago. Something big is going on. Something huge is behind all the fuss and fury and nonsense which is going on mainstream news right now, including things that I frankly think of as maybe diversions to keep news people from really understanding what is about to shift us, globally shift us under our feet into an entirely new paradigm.
Absolutely. And that's a hallmark, I suppose, of the powers, the globalist powers, is to keep us off kilter and make sure our gaze is affixed somewhere else as opposed to where it should be. But one of the things... Go ahead.
There's an old Mark Twain saying that I use time and time again, which is, when it's steamboat time, you steam. I have thought for decades that this moment, disclosure, which is a word which I really don't like, but we'll use it, meaning the unveiling, the apocalypse. Remember, the apocalypse doesn't mean disaster. It means enlightenment. It means knowledge. That the apocalypse would come circa 2012 when the physics of the solar system was right to allow in consciousness this kind of huge leap in understanding who we are, where we came from, and who our great ancestors were, and what we have to do to put it back together again. That you can't do that any old, Thursday. You have to wait for the universe literally to manifest the right energies, the right frequencies, the right background environment, talking in terms of HD physics, that would allow this political and consciousness transformation to proceed, going through, metaphorically speaking, the evidence on these images, that someone came before us in this solar system with this extraordinary power and potential and built and remodeled the solar system into whatever its image was of a place, to live for trillions of people, trillions, not on Earth, but off Earth, on all kinds of other worlds, on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter, the moons of Saturn, maybe even as far in toward the sun as Venus, and maybe even Mercury. We have evidence that there are structures, ancient decaying structures buried in the lava on Mercury, coming from the Mercury mission, the Messenger mission, which was set up a couple of years ago. The reason I'm going into this backdrop is because what we have now done, or what we have now seen done, is a tipping point in the cover-up of this prodigious, extraordinary history of which the human race is somehow a part. My feeling for a long time has been that against this incredible, splendid backdrop, even in ruins, where we're looking at cities covered with domes that are hundreds, if not 1,000 miles across on, among other places, the moon. When we're looking at entire moonlets that have been reshaped and terraformed is a word which is used about talking in relation to turning, desolate places into habitable Earth-type environments. All of that was done by somebody who came before. And then in some monstrous, extraordinary cataclysm, a catastrophe, it all was washed away. And when I say washed away, I don't mean that literally, because obviously in space there's no, free water and floods, but it was all somehow destroyed in a prodigious cataclysm of unimaginable proportions, which has left nothing but ruined worlds as far as we can see, except for the Earth. The Earth is the only place, the only lifeboat in this sea of desolate and dead derelicts. And when I look at news items of various celestial phenomenon, put out over Yahoo or AOL or the networks for various people, like you're going to see this and this comet come by, or you're going to see this, lunar eclipse, you're going to see this close alignment, opposition, or conjunction, I can't help but think that an awful lot of the objects that are milling around out there in various orbits and, coming and going and visible in various spectacular ways is just the faintest hint, the faintest ghost of the extraordinary splendor of the civilization that actually created and put these things into these orbits, remaking the entire solar system in whatever it was is its image. So what are we all doing here? Well, in the model that, life is very hard to destroy totally, in this huge catastrophe that overwhelmed the solar system about 65 million years ago, in the mainstream model, what that did was clear the dinosaurs away and make room for this little tiny set of, micro rats, these little mammals that eventually evolved up to be primates and then human beings who are looking at the stars and wondering about what's out there.